Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we're not just reading history, we're peering through the veils of time into a realm where faith clashed with fear, and medicine was as mysterious as the plague itself. We're exploring the enigmatic world of the medieval plague doctors, those haunting figures who walked among the dying in an age of despair. I want to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you are curled up under the covers, preparing to drift into sleep, or simply seeking a quiet moment of reflection, I'm deeply grateful that you've chosen to spend this twilight hour with me. If you feel like sharing, let me know where in the world you're listening from, or what time of day it is for you right now. For now, get cozy, settle in, and let the whispers of medieval Europe's shadowed streets carry you away. Our journey begins on a cold morning in the 14th century, where a lone figure cloaked in black moves through the mist, the plague doctor. Now, let's begin. Amid the great plagues that ravaged medieval Europe, this ominous spectre emerged, clad head to toe in black, with a long beak-like mask, a wide-brimmed hat, and a staff to prod and examine the afflicted. The plague doctor is an image at once chilling and captivating, a grim symbol of humanity's age-old battle against epidemic disease. But who were these men behind the masks? What did their day-to-day existence entail as they wandered the narrow, fetid streets of plague-stricken towns and villages? What theories and treatments did they employ, and to what effect? How were they viewed by their patients and contemporaries? And what legacy, what lessons do they leave us centuries later as we grapple with our own invisible enemies? These are some of the questions we'll ponder together in this dimly lit chat. As we begin, let's set the stage. Picture a typical medieval European town in the 14th century. The cramped, crooked streets are lined with wood frame houses, their upper stories jutting out precariously over the paths below. The air is thick with the smells of human and animal waste, rotting food, and smoke from hearth fires. In the marketplace, hawkers and hagglers shout and gesture over baskets of bread, barrels of ale, and bolts of coarse-spun cloth. A blacksmith hammers away at his forge, while a tanner scrapes hides in a vat of urine, and a chandler dips wicks into tallow. Church bells toll the hours as black-robed monks shuffle past on their way to prayer. Death and disease are no strangers here. Infections, accidents, malnutrition, and childbirth complications fill fresh graves with grim regularity. The people are inured to loss and suffering as immutable facts of life. But even they cannot imagine the catastrophe that is about to engulf them, an apocalypse of unrivaled proportions that will upend every aspect of society and give rise to a new macabre breed of medical men. The year is 1347. And the Black Death is about to make landfall in Europe. Like a dark tide, the pestilence sweeps in from the east, carried on the ships of merchants and marauders. It creeps along trade routes and caravan trails, clings to the hooves of horses and the hems of cloaks. From the shores of Italy and France, it surges across the continent in wave after relentless wave. The populations of whole regions are decimated, cut down like stalks of wheat before a scythe. In Siena, 80,000 perish in the span of just 6 months. Florence loses 60% of its citizens. England and Wales, half their inhabitants. Before it runs its course, as many as 200 million lives will be claimed across Europe, Asia, and Africa. An unfathomable toll. The social and psychological scars will linger for generations. Medieval medicine, for all its celebrated universities and learned treatises, is woefully unequipped to combat this menace. It is an ancient art, passed down from the Greeks and Romans, still rooted in the idea of balancing the four cardinal humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness, physicians believe, arises from an excess or deficiency of these vital fluids. But how to correct such an imbalance when the very air seems pestilent, when noxious miasmas seep into the pores and corrupt the lungs with every breath? At first, the traditional healers, the monks and mediciners do what they can. They prescribe their usual regimens, purifying infusions, bloodletting, induced vomiting, cupping and scarification. When these fail, as fail they must, they turn to increasingly desperate measures. Sufferers are bled until they swoon. Leeches are applied by the hundreds. Poultices of onion and vinegar, arsenic and mercury are pressed onto weeping buboes. In some towns, great bonfires are lit in the streets to drive out the foul airs, while in others, pigs are led through the alleys in the belief that they will absorb the pestilence, all to no avail. The plague spreads inexorably, leaping from house to house, parish to parish, unhindered by rank or piety or good intentions. King Alfonso XI of Castile succumbs, as does the daughter of the English king, Edward III. In Avignon, the seat of the Pope, over half the cardinals perish. Whole monasteries fall silent as their inhabitants are entombed within. As fear and despair mount, a dark undercurrent of suspicion takes hold. Someone, something, must be to blame for this calamity. Surely it is a punishment from God, a scourging of humanity for its manifold sins. Or perhaps there is a more earthly culprit, a human hand behind the horrors. Rumours circulate of Jews poisoning wells, of lepers and beggars spreading contagion for spite. Pogroms and witch hunts flare up, adding to the unfolding tragedy. Amidst this chaos, the plague doctor makes his first appearance. With the established medical authorities overwhelmed and traditional treatments proving futile, city governments begin hiring these specialised practitioners on short-term contracts to attend to the infected. Many are young physicians just starting their careers, driven by a mix of civic duty, scientific curiosity, and economic desperation. Others are barber surgeons, apothecaries, or even laymen with no medical training at all, lured by the promise of steady pay in a time of upheaval. Perhaps the most famous origin story concerns one Charles Delorme, a 17th century French physician in service to the royal court. Delorme is often credited with inventing the iconic plague doctor outfit, though in truth, similar protective garments had been in use for hundreds of years prior. Nonetheless, his design became the archetype, the one immortalized in countless woodcuts and engravings, and still instantly recognizable today. Picture, if you will, this uncanny figure, clad head to toe in heavy black oilcloth, the fabric stiff and glossy and reeking of wax. Beneath a wide-brimmed leather hat, a mask with glass eye openings, and a long, beak-like protrusion juts out, stuffed with straw, herbs, and spices to filter the air. The hands are encased in thick leather gloves, the feet in tall boots, and in one hand, a slender wooden cane, used to examine patients from a safe distance. Imagine this spectral shape looming in your doorway as you lay fevered and writhing on a sweat-soaked cot. The moans of your family echoing from the next room. The stench of sickness and death inescapable. How terrifying and alien he must have appeared, this ominous emissary, as much a symbol of dread as of hope. In one account, a plague doctor is mistaken for the Grim Reaper himself and chased out of town by a mob. It's not hard to see why. Yet beneath the oilcloth and behind the glass eyes were very human, very frightened men. They were not immune to the pestilence, and they knew it, hence the elaborate precautions. Many did it out of a sense of duty, feeling, as one surgeon wrote, that honour and conscience obliged them to lend their aid to the individuals and the people who had paid for and nourished their studies. Others, less altruistically, were drawn by the promise of generous wages in a destabilized economy. Some plague doctors made small fortunes, charging exorbitant fees to desperate towns. Others took bribes from bereaved families to falsify death certificates, marking the plague's victims as casualties of more mundane illnesses, so they could be given proper burials rather than tossed ignominiously into mass graves. Of course, many paid the ultimate price themselves, succumbing to the contagion and adding their own corpses to the growing piles. So what did a typical day entail for these enigmatic figures? For some, the grim routine began even before dawn, with a visit to the plague pits, those ghastly trenches where the dead were heaped like cordwood. Here, the plague doctor would examine any newly delivered bodies, documenting age, sex, apparent symptoms, and time of death for the city records. He would also oversee the body carriers, the night soil men tasked with hauling away the pestilent remains. Once the sun rose, the doctor would make his rounds, moving from house to house and street to street, his ominous silhouette heralded by the tolling of a bell and cries of, "Bring out your dead!" He would knock at each door with the butt of his cane, calling for the sick to be brought forth. Then, from a safe distance, he would inspect the sufferers, taking note of fever, chills, buboes, blackened extremities. He would consult with whatever family remained, offering prognoses and prescribing treatments. And what treatments they were. Steeped in the ancient Greek notion of balancing the humours, and with only the dimmest understanding of human anatomy, let alone germ theory, the plague doctor's arsenal was a grim collection of folk remedies, superstitions, and what can only be described as sanctioned quackery. Bloodletting by lancet or leeches was a mainstay, thought to remove excess or bad blood. Likewise, purging with laxatives and emetics to void the body of imagined toxins. Buboes were poulticed or lanced, and oozing wounds cauterized with boiling oil or red-hot irons. Other cures were even more outlandish. Mercury and arsenic compounds were prescribed on the theory that like cures like. Crushed emeralds and pearls were administered as tonics. Potions of ground unicorn horn were sold for exorbitant sums. Plague waters, containing everything from treacle to the pus of dead buboes, were hawked as cure-alls. One concoction, the famous 𝐒𝐤𝐥𝐞𝐞𝐩, contained over 60 ingredients including viper flesh, opium and cinnamon, and had to be aged for years like a fine wine. Of course, none of it worked. Or rather, nothing worked consistently or predictably. Some sufferers did recover, whether due to natural immunity, sheer chance, or perhaps the occasional lucky remedy that stumbled upon a legitimate curative property. But the vast majority succumbed, their agonies compounded by the ministrations of their masked attendants. Yet the plague doctors soldiered on, driven by duty, desperation, or delusion. They sustained themselves however they could, some with drink or opium, others with gallows humour or grim fascination at the bodily ravages they witnessed. A rare few, like the Italian poet-physician Michele Savonarola, found solace in writing, leaving behind harrowing accounts of their experiences. I examined the bodies of the dead, inspected the entrails, and observed the fluids, Savonarola wrote. I opened many corpses. I did not fear death. I served the sick with constancy, and I learned much from these cases. Among the ranks of these dark angels were a few figures who achieved a measure of renown, or at least notoriety, in their own time. Perhaps the most famous was Nostradamus, the French astrologer and reputed prophet who began his career as a plague doctor in the 1520s. For years, he tended to the stricken in Provence, allegedly pioneering a rose pill of his own devising, the ingredients of which are now lost. While some hailed him as a miracle worker, others accused him of sorcery and Satanism. Ultimately, Nostradamus left medicine behind to devote himself to the occult arts for which he is now remembered. Another notable figure was Paracelsus, the Swiss-German philosopher and physician who rejected the traditional humoral theories in favor of a more alchemical approach. Paracelsus saw the plague as a poison that could be countered with other poisons, including mercury and arsenic. He also championed the use of opium to relieve suffering, a practice that earned him both praise and condemnation. Though he himself succumbed to the plague in 1541, Paracelsus's ideas helped to challenge the stale orthodoxies of medieval medicine. Lesser-known plague doctors made their marks in other ways. There was John of Burgundy, who published a widely read treatise on the epidemic, advising a regimen of bleeding, purging, and the application of a live chicken to draw out the pestilence. There was Thomas Fairford, an Englishman who claimed to have cured hundreds with a nostrum made of honey, treacle, and the scrapings of human skulls. And there was Michel de Nostradam, not to be confused with the aforementioned Nostradamus, who attained a sort of grim celebrity for his flamboyant costume, which featured red leather boots and a cloak embroidered with scorpions and magical symbols. As the plague finally began to loosen its grip in the late 17th century, the figure of the plague doctor gradually faded from the scene. Their services were no longer in such desperate demand, and many of their more outlandish remedies were coming under increasing scrutiny and ridicule from a new generation of empirically minded physicians. Some, like Nostradamus, reinvented themselves in other lines of work. Others simply retired on their earnings or faded into obscurity. But the plague doctor was not to be forgotten. He had seared himself into the popular imagination, becoming a stock character in folklore, literature, and art. In the Danse Macabre and other Memento Mori works, he appeared as a skeletal figure leading the doomed in their final procession. In the drawings of Albrecht Dürer and the woodcuts of Hans Holbein, he loomed as a dark messenger, a spectre of dread and fascination. Writers and poets seized on his eerie mystique as well. Boccaccio featured a plague doctor character in his Decameron, as did Defoe in A Journal of the Plague Year. Edgar Allan Poe invoked the Mask of the Red Death in his famous story. More recently, the video game Assassin's Creed featured a plague doctor villain, while Japanese manga and anime have reimagined the character as a kind of gothic superhero. For all this darkly romantic appeal, it's worth pausing to consider the real human tragedy behind the plague doctor's macabre iconography. These were men confronting a horror of unimaginable scale, armed with little more than pseudoscience, superstition, and a hideous costume. That some acted out of noble self-sacrifice and others out of crass opportunism is perhaps less revealing than the fact that, in the face of such overwhelming calamity, human beings responded with the same mix of altruism and avarice, curiosity and terror, reason and raving that we always have. If there is a lesson to be drawn from the plague doctor's grim visage, perhaps it is simply this: that in times of crisis, people will always grasp for whatever certainty they can, however illusory or ill-conceived. They will place their faith in shamans and showmen, in folk cures and old wives' tales, in prayer and portent and desperate quackery, and sometimes, in their confusion and despair, they will lash out at convenient scapegoats, seeing in the other the spectres of their own dread. It's a lesson we might take to heart in our own era of pandemic anxiety and cultural unease. When confronted with the uncanny and implacable, the perils both microscopic and ineffable, how do we arm ourselves? With science, with reason, with compassion and cool-headed resolve? Or do we, too, reach for the nostrums and talismans, the face masks and funny hats, the seductive certainties of a simpler age? As we lie in repose, letting these questions drift and disperse like the imagined miasmas of medieval streets, we might just detect the faint rattle of the plague doctor's cane, that hollow memento mori tapping at the door of history, warning of the perils of forgetting, and inviting us always to reckon with our fragile humanity. From this snug vantage, across the centuries and yet not so very far at all, the plague doctor keeps his eternal vigil, a grim reminder, and perhaps, in his own strange way, a guardian and guide. And with that, dear listener, we will draw this darkly dreamy discourse to a close. As always, I invite you to reflect on what you've heard, to follow the threads of your own curiosity into the dim-lit corners of history, and to share your thoughts with me and your fellow listeners. If this chronicle of the Plague Doctor has piqued your interest or stirred your imagination, I encourage you to visit the sources in the description to learn more. Part 6. Profiles of notable plague doctors. The life of a plague doctor was one of grim duty and ceaseless toil. To most, they were faceless figures, clad in black, their identities concealed behind beaked masks. But some of these daring men left deeper marks on history, becoming legends in their own right. One such figure was Michel de Nostradam, better known as Nostradamus. Long before he rose to fame as an astrologer and supposed prophet, the young Frenchman worked as a plague doctor in the 1520s. Trained in the medical arts at the University of Montpellier, he travelled through Provence, treating the sick with unorthodox methods like bloodletting, herbal remedies, and fastidious hygiene. While his efforts likely had little effect, he cultivated an early reputation as a compassionate and dedicated healer. Another iconic plague doctor was the infamous Dr. Schnabel of Rome, whose terrifying likeness was captured in a 17th century engraving by German artist Paul Fürst. The image, titled Dr. Beak from Rome, shows a gaunt figure clad head to toe in black, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and clutching a long cane. Most unsettling is his elongated, beak-like mask, stuffed with straw and pungent herbs to filter out the pestilential miasmas thought to spread disease. According to legend, Schnabel lured the plague out of Rome like a Pied Piper, leading the Black Death away with his echoing cries of "I am the plague doctor." Less theatrical, but more influential, was the 14th century French physician John of Burgundy. In the midst of the Black Death, John published a widely read treatise on the epidemic, the cure and prevention of the pestilence. His prescriptions blended Galenic medicine with folk remedies and religious rituals. He promoted bloodletting, purging, and the use of theriac, a cure-all concoction that typically included viper flesh, opium, and up to 80 other ingredients. John also stressed the importance of prayer, penitence, and pilgrimage to ward off the plague, which he attributed to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. While John's remedies had little effect on the implacable bacterium behind the plague, his writings shaped the medieval medical response to the greatest health crisis in European history. These notable plague doctors, from the famous to the forgotten, shared a common purpose: to minister to the sick and dying in times of unspeakable horror. They confronted the Black Death with the limited tools and knowledge of their time, often at great personal risk. Some, like Nostradamus, went on to greater fame in other pursuits. Others, like Dr. Schnabel, became enduring symbols of the plague's terror. And still others, like John of Burgundy, left a lasting mark on medieval medicine, for better or worse. While the efficacy of their treatments was doubtful, their bravery and determination in the face of a pitiless foe remains a testament to the timeless resilience of the human spirit. Part 7. The Plague Doctor in Art and Literature. As the Black Death raced across medieval Europe, it left a grim imprint on the arts and culture of the time. Few images better captured the morbid spirit of the age than the Plague Doctor, with his ominous beaked mask, black robes, and aura of death. This chilling figure soon became a stock character in medieval and Renaissance art, appearing in manuscript illustrations, woodblock prints, and haunting oil paintings. One of the most famous artistic representations of the plague doctor can be found in the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. This allegorical genre, which emerged in the 15th century, depicts the universality of death, showing skeletons and corpses leading people from all walks of life in a grim procession to the grave. In many Danse Macabre artworks, the plague doctor is shown joining the morbid dance, his beaked mask and black robes making him almost indistinguishable from the grinning skeletons. Another iconic plague doctor image appears in Peter Bruegel, the Elder's 1562 painting, The Triumph of Death. This nightmarish vision shows an army of skeletons laying waste to a blighted landscape, slaughtering peasants and nobles alike. In the center of the canvas, a gaunt plague doctor examines a dying man, his beak-like mask giving him the appearance of a monstrous bird of prey. The painting captures the helplessness and despair of a society overwhelmed by death, with the plague doctor as a grim avatar of the age. The plague doctor also stalked the pages of medieval and Renaissance literature. In Giovanni Boccaccio's 1353 masterpiece, The Decameron, a group of young Florentines flee the Black Death by hiding out in a villa and telling each other stories. Several of these tales feature plague doctors, portrayed as either helpless charlatans or heartless profiteers. In one memorable scene, a plague doctor refuses to treat a dying man unless he is paid in advance, only to be tricked out of his fee by the quick-witted victim. Plague doctors also haunt the works of later writers, from Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year to Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. In Defoe's 1722 novel, based on accounts of the 1665 Great Plague of London, the narrator encounters several plague doctors, depicting them as brave but ultimately futile figures, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the epidemic. In Poe's 1842 short story, a mysterious figure in a mask like the countenance of a stiffened corpse crashes a masquerade ball, bringing the plague to a group of decadent revelers. The imagery evokes the classic plague doctor, a grim reaper in beaked mask and black robes. From the medieval Danse Macabre to the works of Poe, the plague doctor endured as a potent symbol of humanity's helplessness in the face of death. In a world where medicine was powerless against the ravages of plague, this ominous figure represented both hope and despair, a dark angel offering cold comfort to the suffering. Today, the plague doctor remains an iconic image, a chilling reminder of a time when death stalked the streets and no one, from peasant to prince, was safe from its icy grasp. Part 8. The Decline of the Plague Doctor. As the great wave of the Black Death receded in the late 14th century, Europe slowly began to recover from the devastation. But the spectre of plague lingered, with periodic outbreaks flaring up over the next 300 years. Throughout this time, plague doctors remained on the front lines of the medical response, their eerie beaked masks and black robes, a chilling reminder of the ever-present threat. However, as the 17th century dawned, the practice of specialized plague doctors began to wane. The great pandemics of the medieval period gave way to more localized outbreaks, and many cities no longer felt the need to maintain dedicated plague doctors on the payroll. At the same time, the intellectual winds of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution were sweeping away old ideas about medicine and disease. One key figure in this transition was the Swiss physician Paracelsus, who rejected the ancient Greek theory of the four humours that had long underpinned medieval medicine. Paracelsus argued that diseases had specific causes, rather than being the result of general imbalances in the body. He also promoted the use of chemical remedies and mineral baths, rather than the traditional bloodletting and purging favoured by plague doctors. As these new medical ideas spread, the old ways of the plague doctors came under increasing scrutiny. Many of their treatments, such as applying mercury ointments or inducing vomiting with hellebore, were now seen as ineffective at best and harmful at worst. The plague doctor's signature beak mask, once thought to protect against pestilential miasmas, was now ridiculed as a useless relic of a bygone age. Yet, even as their methods were discredited, plague doctors continued to ply their trade in some parts of Europe. In the 17th and 18th centuries, outbreaks of plague still occasionally struck cities like Marseille, Messina, and Moscow. In these times of crisis, local authorities still turned to the familiar figure of the plague doctor with his beaked mask and black robes to tend to the sick and dying. One of the last known plague doctors was Jean-Jacques Poutot, who served in Marseille during the Great Plague of 1720. Poutot was a distinguished surgeon who had studied under the famed anatomist Guillaume Desnouettes. When the plague struck Marseille, Poutot donned the traditional plague doctor's garb and worked tirelessly to treat the sick, earning widespread praise for his dedication and skill. However, Poutot's success was the exception rather than the rule. By the late 18th century, the plague doctor had largely faded into history, a relic of a darker time when death stalked the streets and medicine was powerless to stop it. The last recorded appearance of a plague doctor in Europe was in 1819, during an outbreak of cholera in Cephalonia, Greece. After that, the beaked mask and black robes of the plague doctor were consigned to the realm of history and legend. Today, the plague doctor lives on mainly as a haunting image in art and literature, a symbol of the grim realities of life in a time before modern medicine. In an age of antibiotics and vaccines, it is hard to imagine the terror and despair that gripped medieval Europe during the Black Death. But the plague doctor remains a chilling reminder of a time when death was always just a breath away and humanity struggled to find hope in the face of an implacable foe. Part 9. Evaluating the plague doctor's legacy. Looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, it is easy to dismiss the medieval plague doctor as a hopeless quack, peddling futile remedies in the face of an unstoppable disease. And indeed, it is true that many of their treatments, from bloodletting to mercury ointments, did little to stem the tide of the Black Death. Some plague doctors were undoubtedly charlatans or profiteers, exploiting the desperation of a society in crisis for personal gain. Yet to simply write off the plague doctor as a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale would be to miss the deeper significance of their legacy. In a time of unimaginable horror and suffering, these brave men and women stepped forward to confront an enemy that no one understood and few could escape. They did so with little knowledge of the true nature of the disease they faced, armed only with the limited tools and theories of medieval medicine. In this sense, the plague doctor can be seen as a symbol of human resilience and compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity. At a time when many were understandably tempted to flee or hide from the contagion, the plague doctor chose to stay and fight, often at great personal risk. They tended to the sick and dying, offering what comfort and solace they could, even if their treatments were largely ineffective. Moreover, while the plague doctor's methods may have been misguided by modern standards, they represented the best medical knowledge of their time. The theory of the four humours, which held that disease was caused by imbalances in the body's fluids, had been the foundation of Western medicine since the days of Hippocrates. The plague doctor's signature beak mask, stuffed with sweet herbs to filter out bad air, was a logical extension of the prevailing miasma theory of disease. In this light, the plague doctor can be seen as a forerunner of the modern medical professional, bravely confronting the great health crises of their age with the tools and knowledge available to them. Just as today's doctors and nurses have battled COVID-19 with ventilators and experimental vaccines, the plague doctors of old fought the Black Death with leeches and poultices, doing the best they could in the face of a terrifying unknown. Of course, the plague doctor was not a perfect hero. Like all human beings, they were a product of their time, with all the flaws and limitations that entailed. Some undoubtedly used their position for personal enrichment or power, exploiting the suffering of others for their own gain. And their reliance on superstition and folk remedies undoubtedly caused harm to many of their patients. But to focus solely on these flaws would be to miss the larger picture. The plague doctor, for all their faults, represented a glimmer of light in a time of profound darkness. They offered hope and solace to a society in the grip of an existential crisis, providing a reminder that even in the worst of times, human compassion and resilience can endure. Conclusion: lessons from the plague doctor. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the medieval plague doctor is the lessons they offer for our own time. In an age of global pandemics, climate change, and social upheaval, the spectre of the plague doctor looms large, a reminder of the fragility of human life and the limits of our control over the natural world. Like the plague doctors of old, we too are confronting a terrifying and invisible enemy, armed only with the imperfect tools of our own time. And like them, we have seen the best and worst of human nature in the face of crisis, from acts of selfless heroism to the spread of misinformation and the exploitation of fear for personal or political gain. Yet the story of the plague doctor also offers hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will step forward to serve and protect their fellow human beings. It shows us that progress is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds, and that the pursuit of knowledge and understanding can light the way through the darkness. Perhaps most importantly, the legacy of the plague doctor reminds us of the enduring power of human compassion and resilience. In a world that can often seem cold and indifferent to our struggles, the plague doctor stands as a symbol of our capacity to care for one another, even in the face of unimaginable suffering and loss. As we confront the great challenges of our own time, we would do well to remember the lessons of the plague doctor, to embrace science and reason, while also recognizing the limits of our knowledge, to act with courage and compassion, even in the face of fear and uncertainty, and to never lose sight of our shared humanity, even in the darkest of times. For in the end, it is this spirit of resilience and compassion that will see us through the trials ahead, just as it sustained our ancestors through the horrors of the Black Death. And as we look back on the haunting figure of the plague doctor, cloaked in black and beaked in mystery, we may find in their example a glimmer of hope for our own uncertain future. So let us honor the legacy of the plague doctor, not as a relic of a bygone age, but as a timeless reminder of the best and worst of human nature. Let us learn from their mistakes and emulate their courage as we confront the great challenges of our own time with the same spirit of compassion and resilience that sustained our ancestors through the darkest days of history. And let us never forget the lesson at the heart of the plague doctor's story, that even in the face of the greatest horrors and the deepest despair, the human spirit endures, unbroken and unbowed, a testament to the unquenchable resilience of the human heart. With that, our journey through the haunting and enigmatic world of the medieval plague doctor comes to a close. From the dark days of the Black Death to the dawn of modern medicine, this strange and iconic figure has left an indelible mark on our history and our imaginations. May their legacy endure, not as a grim reminder of a bygone age, but as an enduring symbol of the human capacity for courage, compassion, and resilience in the face of the darkest of times. And may their story continue to inspire and enlighten us as we navigate the challenges and uncertainties of our own era with the same spirit of hope and determination that sustained our ancestors through the long centuries of the past. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the pages of history. I hope that this exploration of the life and times of the medieval plague doctor has been both informative and thought-provoking, and that it has shed new light on a figure who has long been shrouded in mystery and legend. Until next time, this is your humble guide to the fascinating world of history, signing off. And remember, even in the darkest of times, there is always hope to be found in the enduring power of the human spirit. Part 6. Profiles of notable plague doctors. Among the ranks of plague doctors, a few intriguing individuals left a mark on history that endures to this day. Perhaps the most famous is Michel de Nostradam, better known as Nostradamus. Long before he achieved renown as an astrologer and prophet, the young Frenchman worked as a plague doctor in the 1520s and 30s. Nostradamus treated hundreds of patients during outbreaks in Montpellier and Aix-en-Provence, displaying a dedication that earned him the respect of locals. He even developed his own treatment called the rose pill, a herbal concoction that some credited with saving lives. Nostradamus's experiences as a plague doctor undoubtedly shaped his later fascination with predicting the future. One wonders how the horrors he witnessed, bloated corpses, weeping sores, maddened sufferers, impressed upon his mind the precariousness of life and the ever-present spectre of death. In his famous prophecies, Nostradamus would go on to foretell numerous world-altering events and cataclysms, from the Great Fire of London to the rise of Hitler. Perhaps his visions of a bleak, pestilence-ravaged future began with the all-too-real nightmares of plague hospitals. Another iconic plague doctor was the enigmatic figure known as Dr. Schnabel of Rome. Though little is known about the real man behind the legend, Dr. Schnabel lives on in a famous 17th century engraving by German artist Paul Fürst. The haunting image shows the plague doctor in his full-beaked regalia, looming over a town strewn with the dead and dying. According to folklore, Dr. Schnabel could lure the plague out of a city by permitting it to cling to his waxed leather coat. He would then taunt and mock the disease until it slinked away in humiliation, leaving the town in peace. Of course, this tale of a heroic plague-baiting doctor is pure fantasy, but its popularity throughout the centuries suggests how desperate people have always been to find saviors in times of overwhelming sickness and death. Dr. Schnabel represents the hope that even against an unstoppable pandemic, clever and daring individuals can make a difference through ingenuity and willpower. On the scholarly front, one plague doctor stood out for his contributions to medical literature. In 1365, John of Burgundy published his influential treatise on the epidemic, which guided generations of plague doctors in their fight against the scourge. John promoted remedies that were advanced for the time, like bloodletting, purgative medicines, and herbal fumigation. But he also prescribed some rather horrifying treatments, like applying a plaster made from tree frogs, or drinking a brew containing powdered gems and unicorn horns. Most notorious was John's enthusiastic endorsement of 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐼𝐴, a cure-all concoction brewed from dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh and opium. 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐼𝐴 had been around since ancient times, but plague doctors like John helped popularize it as a medicine for everything from stomach aches to the Black Death itself. Needless to say, it didn't work, but that didn't stop 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐼𝐴 from remaining a staple of European apothecaries for centuries. Figures like Nostradamus, Dr. Schnabel, and John of Burgundy exemplify the complex legacy of the medieval plague doctor. Men of learning and determination who fought an existential battle armed only with crude tools and pseudoscience. Opportunists and hucksters who profited from panic and gullibility with macabre flair. Symbols of both selfless sacrifice and the dangers of unchecked quackery. Through it all, their compelling stories continue to fascinate us and illuminate a dark yet pivotal chapter in human history. Part 7. The Plague Doctor in Art and Literature. For an enigmatic, short-lived medical profession, plague doctors cast a long shadow over the artistic imagination. Their iconic beaked visage crops up again and again in medieval and Renaissance art, often as a grim symbol of the omnipresence of death. One of the earliest known representations is a 15th century French illuminated manuscript showing a hawk-like plague doctor looming over a sickbed. The sinister figure points an accusatory finger at the dying patient, as if condemning them to their fate. This association between plague doctors and the inescapable spectre of mortality reached its apex in the danse macabre, or dance of death. A common motif in late medieval artwork, the danse macabre depicts characters from all walks of life, kings, peasants, bishops, and children, being led to the grave in a morbid conga line, and who gleefully presides over this ghoulish scene? None other than the plague doctor, skeletal and beaked, ushering souls into the afterlife with a bony hand. Plague doctors also haunted the edges of Renaissance masterpieces like Peter Bruegel's famous painting, The Triumph of Death. Amidst the apocalyptic hellscape of rampaging skeletons and burning ships, a plague doctor can be spotted nonchalantly strolling through the chaos, unperturbed by the wholesale destruction around him. Here, the plague doctor almost merges with the figure of death itself, an implacable agent of doom calmly going about his business. In literature, plague doctors often embodied the darkly comedic absurdities of a world turned upside down by pandemic. Boccaccio set the template in his Decameron, which follows 10 young Florentines as they escape the Black Death and pass the time telling bawdy tales. The first story centers on the pompous Dr. Simone de Villa, a quack who claims he can diagnose patients just by looking at their urine. When a prankster switches samples as a joke, hilarity ensues as the clueless doctor reads the ailments of a pregnant woman in a man's pee. Other writers deployed plague doctors as more tragic figures, like Daniel Defoe in his pioneering novel, A Journal of the Plague Year. Though not a central character, Defoe's fictional physician Dr. Heath somberly dispenses advice and attends to the mounting dead with stoic resolve. He represents the futility of human efforts against an indomitable plague, but also the necessity of perseverance in the face of hopelessness. The image of the plague doctor reached its most romantic and macabre zenith in the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe name-dropped plague doctors in several tales, most famously in The Masque of the Red Death. In this story, Prince Prospero and his nobles attempt to seal themselves off from a hideous pestilence in a Gothic abbey. At a climactic masquerade ball, a mysterious guest arrives dressed in funeral robes and a bloody beaked mask, the Red Death incarnate as a plague doctor. One by one, the horrified revelers succumb to the disease, realizing too late that death comes for us all. From medieval manuscripts to the genius of Poe, plague doctors endure in our artistic memory because they so hauntingly fuse the identities of healer and harbinger of doom. With their ominous garb and prophetic presence, plague doctors have always been ready-made metaphors for the allure and terror of mortality. Even today, they remain a visual shorthand for our deepest fears of contagion, isolation, and the unknown. Part 8. The Decline of the Plague Doctor. As the cataclysmic waves of the Black Death receded in the late 17th century, so too did the sight of plague doctors stalking the streets of Europe's cities. The practice of contracting specialized physicians to treat plague victims faded as major outbreaks became more infrequent and advances in sanitation gradually reduced the severity of the disease. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, plague doctors had largely vanished from the medical landscape, relegated to the realm of memory and myth. Several factors contributed to the decline of the plague doctor. One was simply a drop in demand as the plague itself became less of an existential threat. Bubonic plague remained a deadly problem well into the 19th century, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. but it no longer triggered the same level of all-encompassing panic and social breakdown that had defined the medieval experience. As plague evolved into more of a persistent nuisance than a civilization killer, the need for dedicated plague fighters diminished. At the same time, the intellectual tides were turning against many of the core beliefs and practices of the plague doctor tradition. The ancient Greek concept of humoral medicine, which had dominated Western medicine for centuries, was increasingly discredited by new scientific ideas in the 16th and 17th centuries. Reformers like Paracelsus and Vesalius challenged the notion that disease resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids, instead proposing chemical and anatomical explanations. As this new empirical approach took hold, many scholars began to question the value of plague doctors' traditional remedies like bloodletting, forced purgation, and toxic medicines like mercury and arsenic. In 1665, the English physician Nathaniel Hodges published a scathing treatise on the plague, dismissing the ignorant plague doctors and their methods as useless at best and fatal at worst. For Hodges, the way to fight epidemics was not beaked masks and leeches, but observation, quarantine, and good hygiene. Of course, the plague doctor didn't disappear overnight. In some parts of Europe, particularly areas frequently ravaged by Ottoman armies and their pestilential baggage trains, plague doctors remained a fixture well into the 1700s. In 1720, a Russian plague doctor was reportedly beaten to death by an angry mob who thought his fumigation rituals had unleashed demons upon their village. But by the Napoleonic era, the plague doctor was essentially extinct, more likely to be seen as a character at a costume ball than on an actual battlefield with disease. The beak doctor persisted as a visual symbol of past pandemics, of misguided medical practices, of the thin line between life and death. But the living profession had slipped into the mists of history. This demise reflects the broader trend away from specialized crisis doctors and towards more formalized, institutionalized medicine in the modern era. In their time, plague doctors represented a medical emergency response system, hired on short-term contracts to handle sudden disease flare-ups. But as governments developed standing public health bureaus and hospitals became permanent fixtures in every major city, the lone plague doctor was replaced by an entrenched medical infrastructure. Still, the disappearance of the plague doctor left a void in the European imagination. For centuries, this ominous figure had been the human face of epidemic disease, the personal envoy of death itself. It's no wonder that so many legends and superstitions sprung up around the plague doctor, that they possessed secret knowledge, wielded occult powers, or communed with the dead. In a way, these myths were attempts to make sense of the profound trauma and mystery of the plague years, and perhaps that is the enduring power of the plague doctor. Even in their absence, they remind us of a time when sickness was a terrifying enigma, when medicine seemed as much about magic as science, and when a lone person in a strange mask could be either your salvation or your doom. The plague doctor may be gone, but their ghost lingers on, a relic of a darker age that still speaks to our deepest fears and fascinations. The city of Rome was no stranger to the plague doctor's haunting presence. In the early 1650s, as yet another wave of pestilence ravaged the eternal city, a peculiar figure emerged from the shadows. He called himself Dr. Schnabel, though little is known of his true identity or origins. According to popular legend, Dr. Schnabel claimed to possess a singular ability. He could lure the plague out of Rome like a Pied Piper leading rats. Clad in the grim raiments of his profession, the long waxed coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and the ominous beak mask, Schnabel stalked the streets, visiting the homes of the afflicted. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe a macabre ritual. Schnabel would enter the house and examine the feverish, bubo-ridden patient. Then, he would produce a small vial from the folds of his coat. This, he claimed, contained a secret essence, a distillation of the plague itself. With great ceremony, Schnabel would open the vial and begin to chant in an unknown tongue, his voice muffled behind the beaked mask. The essence, he said, would draw the pestilence out of the victim's body and back into the vial. He would then stopper the container, sealing the disease inside. Night after night, Schnabel repeated this grim performance, moving from house to house, street to street. As word of his strange practice spread, so too did tales of his success. Some swore that his treated patients recovered at a remarkable rate, that the black boils receded and the fever broke. Of course, in an age of superstition and desperation, rumours took on a life of their own. There were darker whispers as well, that Schnabel was a sorcerer, that his essence was a witch's brew, that he'd made a pact with the devil himself. As the epidemic began to wane, Dr. Schnabel vanished from the streets as suddenly as he'd appeared. Some said he left Rome, others that he succumbed to the very plague he fought. Still others whispered that he never existed at all, that he was a mass delusion born of collective terror and grief. Though his historicity remains uncertain, Dr. Schnabel's legacy endures to this day in a famous engraving from the time. It depicts a gaunt figure in full plague Dr. regalia, looming over a city in the grip of pestilence. The image captures the unsettling duality of the plague doctor, at once a beacon of hope and a harbinger of death. This duality is a recurring theme in the plague doctor's representation in art and literature across the centuries. In the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, as the Black Death seared itself into Europe's collective psyche, the plague doctor became a stock figure in a variety of artistic traditions. One of the most famous and chilling examples is the danse macabre, or dance of death. This allegorical genre, which emerged in the wake of the plague, depicts the universality of death, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a grim procession to the grave. In many danse macabre works, the plague doctor appears as a central figure, a grinning skeleton clad in the iconic beaked mask and black robe. One famous fresco in the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, painted in 1424, shows a skeletal doctor leading the dance, a morbid parody of a medical professional. Another iconic work that features plague doctor imagery is Peter Bruegel, the elder's 1562 painting, The Triumph of Death. In this apocalyptic scene, legions of skeletons lay waste to a blighted landscape, slaughtering the living without mercy. Among the chaos, a figure in a plague doctor's robe can be seen tending to the dead and dying, a grim reaper in medical garb. These macabre depictions reflect the deep psychological scars left by the Black Death and its recurrences. For medieval and Renaissance Europeans, the plague doctor became a symbol of mortality itself, a spectre of the omnipresent threat of pestilence. This symbolism carried over into literature as well. In the 14th century, Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio wrote The Decameron, a collection of tales set against the backdrop of the Black Death. In one story, a group of young nobles fleeing plague-ridden Florence encounter a mysterious figure in a black cloak and mask, a clear allusion to the plague doctor. Centuries later, the plague doctor would resurface in the works of Gothic and horror writers. Edgar Allan Poe's 1842 short story, The Masque of the Red Death, features a sinister figure in a funeral shroud and corpse-like mask, an embodiment of the plague itself. While not explicitly a plague doctor, the character draws on the same iconography of death and disease. In more recent times, the plague doctor has been reimagined in everything from steampunk novels to video games, a testament to the enduring power of this macabre symbol. Even in an age of modern medicine, the image of the beaked mask and black robe continues to evoke a primal fear, a reminder of our vulnerability in the face of pandemic. But as the Black Death receded into history and new theories of disease emerged, the practice of the plague doctor began to decline. By the 17th century, The medieval humoral theories that underpinned their treatments were increasingly challenged by new schools of thought. The Swiss physician Paracelsus, considered one of the fathers of toxicology, rejected the idea that disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. Instead, he proposed that illnesses had specific external causes, paving the way for modern germ theory. Under this new paradigm, the plague doctor's arsenal of bloodletting, purging, and toxic mercury treatments seemed increasingly archaic and ineffective. As outbreaks became less frequent and less severe, the need for specialized plague doctors diminished. By the 18th century, the plague doctor was largely a figure of the past, a relic of a darker age. Some isolated cases of plague doctors being deployed still occurred, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, but these were increasingly rare. One of the last recorded instances of a plague doctor in action was during the 1770 to 1772 Moscow plague epidemic. The Russian Empress Catherine the Great, desperate to contain the outbreak, ordered a team of plague doctors to the city to treat the sick and enforce quarantines. But even in this late case, the effectiveness of the plague doctors was limited. Contemporary accounts suggest that many were poorly trained and equipped, and some may have even contributed to spreading the disease through improper handling of patients and bodies. As the Age of Enlightenment gave way to the modern era, the plague doctor faded into the mists of history. Their legacy, however, endured, not as a model of medical efficacy, but as a powerful symbol of human resilience and fallibility in the face of unimaginable catastrophe. Looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, it's easy to dismiss the plague doctor as a tragic figure, a misguided purveyor of pseudoscience and superstition. And indeed, many of their practices undoubtedly caused more harm than good, inflicting additional suffering on already traumatized patients. Yet at the same time, there is something undeniably noble in the plague doctor's willingness to confront an existential threat head-on, to wade into the epicenter of a crisis armed with little more than faith, folklore, and a sense of duty. In an age when even the causes of disease were shrouded in mystery, these individuals put themselves at immense personal risk in the service of their fellow citizens. In that sense, the plague doctor's story is a very human one, a tale of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, struggling to make sense of the senseless, to find order in chaos. Their methods may have been flawed, but their intentions were often admirable, and in their enduring symbolism, the beaked mask, the black robe, the aura of morbid mystery, the plague doctors left an indelible mark on Western culture. They came to represent not just the horrors of disease, but the eternal human struggle against the unknown and the unknowable. It's a struggle that continues to this day. As the COVID-19 pandemic has so vividly demonstrated, we are not so far removed from our medieval ancestors as we might like to believe. We too have grappled with the suddenness of pestilence, the social and economic upheaval, the feelings of helplessness and despair. And like the citizens of the 14th century Florence or the 17th century Rome, we have turned to our doctors and nurses as beacons of hope in the darkness. We've seen them suited up in protective gear, risking their lives on the front lines of an invisible war. In their courage and dedication, we catch a glimpse of the same spirit that animated the plague doctors of old. Of course, our modern medical heroes are armed with science rather than superstition, with ventilators and vaccines rather than bloodletting and beak masks. But the essential human drama remains the same: the struggle to preserve life and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. In that sense, the story of the plague doctor is not just a morbid curiosity from a bygone age. It's a mirror held up to our own time, a reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of the human spirit. As we look back across the centuries, we can see in the plague doctor a reflection of our own fears and hopes, our own strengths and weaknesses. And in their haunting, iconic image, we find a symbol of the indomitable will to persevere, even in the darkest of times. So perhaps the true legacy of the plague doctor is not found in the annals of medical history, but in the resilience of the human heart. In the face of unimaginable horror, these strange, brave figures stood their ground, offering what comfort and hope they could. And in doing so, they etched themselves forever into the collective imagination, a testament to the unyielding spirit that has carried humanity through its darkest hours. As we navigate the uncertainties of our own time, we could do worse than to remember the plague doctor's example, not as a model of medical best practices certainly, but as an emblem of the courage and compassion that shines through in moments of crisis. For as long as there is breath in our lungs and love in our hearts, we will continue to face down the spectres of disease and despair, just as the plague doctors did centuries ago. And in that defiant act of hope, we keep alive the flame of human resilience that has burned through the ages, a light that no darkness can extinguish. So let us honor the memory of the plague doctors, not with unthinking veneration, but with clear-eyed understanding. Let us learn from their mistakes, but also from their bravery. And let us carry forward their legacy, not as a relic of a distant past, but as a living testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. For in the end, that is what the plague doctor's story teaches us, that even in the face of the most unspeakable horrors, there is always hope, always resilience, always the possibility of grace. And that is a lesson that echoes through the centuries, a light that guides us through the darkest of times, and a reminder of the unbreakable bonds of our shared humanity. As we lay our heads down to rest, let us carry that lesson with us into our dreams. Let us find comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn will always come. And let us face the challenges of our own time with the same courage and compassion that animated the plague doctors of old, secure in the faith that, together, we can weather any storm. As the grim spectre of the plague doctor faded into history, their legacy would endure through art, literature, and folklore. For centuries to come, their haunting visage would continue to capture the imaginations of people across Europe and beyond. One of the most famous artistic representations of the plague doctor can be found in the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a common motif in medieval art. These morbid works, often adorning church walls and cemetery gates, depicted the inevitability of death for people of all social classes. Among the skeletons and corpses, one could often spot the ominous figure of the plague doctor, a reminder of the Black Death's indiscriminate reach. Similarly, the plague doctor appears in the iconic Triumph of Death fresco in the Palazzo Abatellis in Palermo, Sicily. Painted by an unknown artist in the late 15th century, this unsettling masterpiece shows Death himself astride a skeletal horse, wielding a scythe as he tramples people from all walks of life. In the background, a cloaked plague doctor tends to the dying, a grim reaper in his own right. These macabre depictions of plague doctors were not limited to the visual arts. In literature too, their eerie presence would be felt long after the Black Death had subsided. The Italian poet and scholar Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague firsthand in Florence, immortalized the figure of the plague doctor in his masterwork, the Decameron. Published in 1353, this collection of novellas features 10 young Florentines who flee the city to escape the pestilence. In their tales, the plague doctor makes several appearances, often as a symbol of death and despair. Centuries later, the plague doctor would continue to haunt the pages of European literature. In Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, the narrator describes the chilling sight of plague doctors roaming the streets of London. Their beaked masks and waxed leather cloaks a telltale sign of the horrors that awaited within the city's quarantined homes. Even in the 19th century, Long after the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Europe, the spectre of the plague doctor lingered in the Gothic imagination. In Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Masque of the Red Death, a mysterious figure dressed in a blood-spattered robe and mask crashes a masquerade ball, bringing with him the deadly disease. Though not explicitly called a plague doctor, Poe's menacing character bears all the hallmarks of this iconic figure. But while the plague doctor became a staple of art and literature, in the real world, their presence gradually faded away. As outbreaks of plague became less frequent and less severe in the 17th and 18th centuries, the need for specialized plague doctors diminished. At the same time, their methods and cures came under increasing scrutiny from a new generation of medical thinkers. One of the most vocal critics of the plague doctors was the Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus. Born in 1493, Paracelsus rejected the traditional Galenic medicine that had dominated Europe for centuries, including the humoral theory that underpinned so much of the plague doctor's work. Instead, he advocated for a new approach based on observation, experimentation, and the use of chemical remedies. Paracelsus dismissed the plague doctors as charlatans and quacks, more interested in collecting their fees than truly helping the sick. Paracelsus's critique was echoed by other medical reformers in the 16th and 17th centuries, such as the French surgeon Ambroise Paré and the English physician Thomas Sydenham. They argued that many of the plague doctor's treatments, like bloodletting and purging, actually weakened patients and made them more susceptible to the disease. As these new ideas gained traction, the practice of hiring specialized plague doctors began to wane. By the 18th century, they had largely disappeared from Western Europe, though a few could still be found in the more remote and backward regions of the continent. In the Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe, for example, plague doctors were still being employed as late as the 1830s to deal with sporadic outbreaks of the disease. But by and large, the plague doctor had become a relic of a darker, more superstitious age. Their legacy, however, endured, not as a model of medical expertise, but as a symbol of the Black Death's unimaginable horrors and the desperate measures people would take to confront them. For us today, it's easy to look back at the plague doctors with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. On one hand, we can admire their bravery in fighting a terrifying disease, often at great personal risk. Many plague doctors were among the few people willing to treat the infected, providing what little comfort and care they could. Some, like Nostradamus, even experimented with new methods and medicines in a genuine attempt to find a cure. On the other hand, we cannot ignore the plague doctor's many shortcomings and failures. For all their good intentions, their methods were often useless at best and actively harmful at worst. In their ignorance of the true causes of disease, they resorted to superstition, pseudoscience, and outright quackery. And in their desperation to be seen doing something, anything, to fight the plague, they sometimes exploited people's fears and made false promises of miraculous cures. In this sense, the plague doctors were not so different from other controversial medical figures throughout history. Like the resurrection men, who dug up fresh corpses for dissection, or the snake oil salesmen, who peddled all manner of dubious elixirs, they operated in a moral grey area, blurring the lines between healer and charlatan. But perhaps this is what makes the plague doctor such an enduringly fascinating and unsettling figure. In their story, we see reflected the age-old human struggle to confront the spectre of death and disease. We see the desperate search for answers in the face of the unknown, and the all-too-human tendency to cling to hope, even in the darkest of times. In a way, the plague doctor's legacy is still with us today. Every time we face a new and terrifying epidemic, from the Spanish flu to AIDS to COVID-19, we grapple with the same questions and challenges that confronted the men behind those beaked masks centuries ago. We too must navigate the uncharted waters of a global health crisis. balancing science and superstition, reason and fear, personal risk and public duty. And just like in the time of the Black Death, we often look to our doctors and healers to guide us through the storm. We place our trust and our lives in their hands, hoping that their knowledge and dedication will see us through to brighter days. But as the story of the plague doctors reminds us that trust is a fragile and precious thing, it must be earned through rigorous science, compassionate care, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, even when the truth is difficult or frightening. For in the end, the lesson of the plague doctor is not about medicine or mortality, but about the eternal human struggle to find meaning and purpose in the face of the abyss. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are always those who will step forward to light the way, imperfect and fallible though they may be. And so we remember the plague doctors not as heroes or villains, but as something much more complex and much more human. They were people who confronted the unimaginable with whatever tools and knowledge they had, driven by a sense of duty, compassion, and perhaps a touch of morbid curiosity. In their haunting visage, we see a reflection of ourselves, our fears and our hopes, our weaknesses and our strengths. And in their story, we find a strange and somber comfort, knowing that even in the face of the greatest horrors, the human spirit endures, ever searching for the light amid the darkness. So let us honor the memory of the plague doctors, not with unthinking reverence, but with clear-eyed understanding. Let us learn from their mistakes and their triumphs, their science and their superstition. And let us carry their legacy forward as we face the challenges and uncertainties of our own time with courage, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to the truth. For in the end, the story of the plague doctor is the story of us all, a testament to the enduring human struggle to find meaning and hope in a world that is often cruel and indifferent. It is a reminder that even in the face of the greatest darkness, there is always a flicker of light, a glimmer of grace, waiting to be found. And so we remember them, these strange and haunting figures from a distant past, not as ghosts or ghouls, but as fellow travelers on the great and perilous journey of life. We remember them with reverence and with humility, knowing that in their story we see our own. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world where their memory is honored, not with fear or revulsion, but with understanding and compassion. Let us dream of a world where the lessons of the plague doctors are not forgotten, but are woven into the very fabric of our lives, a reminder of our shared humanity, our shared fragility, and our shared strength. And let us wake to a new day, ready to face whatever challenges may come, armed with the wisdom of the past and the hope of the future. For in the end, that is the true legacy of the plague doctor, a legacy of resilience, of perseverance, and of the enduring power of the human spirit to triumph over even the darkest of times. Part 6. Profiles of notable plague doctors. Throughout the medieval era, a handful of plague doctors made their mark on history, either through their tireless efforts fighting the disease or the fascinating stories and legends that grew up around them. One of the most intriguing figures was the young man who would become known to history as Nostradamus. Long before he found fame as an astrologer and supposed prophet, Nostradamus worked as a plague doctor in France in the 1520s. Born Michel de Nostradame, he attended the University of Montpellier and gained hands-on experience treating plague victims in Provence. Accounts suggest he pioneered more enlightened methods like fresh air, clean water, and removing corpses from the streets. Some even credit him with creating an early rose pill of vitamin C to strengthen the body. While modern historians doubt many of these claims, his time battling the plague undoubtedly shaped the young doctor and may have sparked his interest in predicting the future. Another mythic plague doctor was the enigmatic figure known as Dr. Schnabel of Rome. Though solid records of his life are scarce, Schnabel was immortalized in a famous 17th century engraving by Paul I. The haunting image shows the plague doctor in his full iconic outfit, stalking through a town strewn with the dead and dying. According to legend, Dr. Schnabel was a fearless and inventive plague fighter, willing to try daring and occult methods beyond the standard practices of the time. Some stories claim he marched through the streets banging a drum, using musical tones to lure the plague away like a snake charmer or Pied Piper. Others say he employed alchemical potions, astrological talismans and incantations alongside his lancing of buboes. How much truth lies behind the Schnabel legends is hard to confirm, but his captivating image in Fürst's engraving ensured his place in the plague doctor pantheon. A somewhat more reputable plague doctor was John of Burgundy, a French physician who published an influential treatise on the Black Death in the 1360s, called the Treatise on the Epidemic. Burgundy's work helped spread many of the standard treatments of the time, including bloodletting, boil lancing, purgative medicines and fumigation with herbs. He also promoted the use of 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐴, a cure-all concoction supposedly created by the ancient Greeks that remained popular into the 18th century. Made from dozens of ingredients like viper flesh, opium, spices, and honey, 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐴 was touted as a miracle remedy for the plague and other ailments. While it may have dulled pain with its narcotic effects, 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐴, of course, did little to truly fight the disease. Nonetheless, Burgundy's writings helped cement his status as an expert and authority on the plague throughout medieval Europe. These notable figures, Nostradamus the visionary, Dr. Schnabel the eccentric, and John of Burgundy the scholar, represent just a sampling of the many doctors who donned the ominous plague mask and battled the Black Death across the centuries. Some were earnest and dedicated, others opportunistic or misguided, but all contributed to the enduring image and mythos of the plague doctor that still haunts the imagination today. And as their stories spread through whispered tales and printed pages, the plague doctor took on a compelling second life as a figure in medieval and Renaissance art. Part 7. The Plague Doctor in Art and Literature. As the Black Death carved its grim path across Europe, the plague doctor became a darkly captivating figure in the artwork of the era. Many woodcuts, manuscript illustrations, and engravings featured skeletally thin plague doctors stalking through towns devastated by disease. In some depictions, the beaked physicians almost seemed to be grim reapers themselves, culling the infected like a personification of death. This macabre medical imagery reached its heights in the 14th and 15th centuries, when artists used plague doctor figures to capture the omnipresent dread and morbidity of a society traumatized by the Black Death. One famous example is the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a common medieval artistic motif showing dancing skeletons, corpses and reapers, representing the all-conquering power of death. Numerous Danse Macabre works included the skeletal plague doctor joining in death's grisly parade. An anonymous 15th century Italian engraving shows a procession of deceased plague victims following a triumphant, scythe-wielding plague doctor against a bleak landscape. Similar scenes appear in the margins of illuminated manuscripts and the exterior carvings of churches, a reminder to viewers that no one was safe from the plague or the beak-masked doctors that heralded it. The plague doctor's ominous silhouette clearly resonated with artists striving to capture the haunting spirit of those death-saturated times. Plague doctors also endured as a literary figure long after the Black Death's peak in the 14th century. In the 1600s, as later outbreaks still menaced Europe, plague doctors appeared in several famous works. The Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, used a plague doctor-like figure as a symbol of human vanity and hypocrisy in his classic story collection, the Decameron. The English writer Daniel Defoe, best known for Robinson Crusoe, mentions plague doctors in his journalistic novel, A Journal of the Plague Year, based on the 1665 London outbreak. Even the American Gothic master Edgar Allan Poe, writing in the 1840s, employed a plague doctor-like mask in his chilling tale, The Mask of the Red Death, in which a mysterious cloaked figure brings a plague to a debauched masquerade ball. Throughout these artworks and stories, the plague doctor serves as a haunting memento mori, a reminder of life's brevity and death's invincible supremacy. With their unsettling masks and aura of fatal futility, plague doctors symbolized the vulnerability and dread that epidemic disease instilled in the medieval European psyche. Even as the Black Death receded and medicine slowly advanced, the plague doctor persisted in the visual and literary imagination, a macabre icon of one of history's darkest chapters. But in the real world of the late 17th and 18th centuries, the era of the plague doctor was gradually, mercifully coming to a close. Part 8. The Decline of the Plague Doctor. By the late 1600s, the plague doctor was starting to seem like a relic of a more barbaric time. The devastation of the Black Death's initial 14th century assault had abated, with outbreaks becoming more localized and sporadic across Europe. At the same time, new medical philosophies and scientific approaches were slowly starting to challenge medieval dogmas about disease. Leaders and scholars increasingly looked upon the old plague doctor ways as ineffective at best and harmful quackery at worst. One influential critic of plague doctors was the Swiss-German physician Paracelsus, often considered the father of toxicology. In the 16th century, he scoffed at the convoluted potions and superstitious methods of many plague doctors, famously declaring that the patients are not helped by all these things, no more than a cow is helped by a new door. Others lambasted plague doctors' reliance on bloodletting, induced vomiting and lancing boils, which likely only worsened suffering without curing anything. The gradual growth of anatomical study, chemical experiments and empirical observation in the 1500s and 1600s led doctors to question the ancient Greek humoral theories that underpinned plague medicine. Authorities also grew tired of the high fees charged by roving plague doctors with dubious credentials. By 1650, most major cities ceased hiring special plague doctors on lucrative contracts, shifting that role to established municipal and royal physicians. The elaborate, expensive outfits worn by plague doctors started to disappear as an extravagance that offered more psychological comfort than real protection. Doctors increasingly emphasized quarantine, sanitation, and safer treatments like soothing syrups and poultices rather than toxic purgatives. The beak-masked wanderers of the medieval plague era faded away. Not that epidemic outbreaks ended altogether. Bubonic plague remained a deadly fact of life in many regions into the 19th century, especially in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Major outbreaks still terrorized Seville, Marseille, and Moscow as late as the 1770s. In these later eras, a dwindling few plague doctors still plied their trade in modified garb. A Flemish engraving from 1656 shows one with a snout-like mask and a long leather cape. An 1819 Nuremberg document describes plague surgeons in wide-brimmed hats, goggles, and beak-nosed masks attending an outbreak in Ottoman lands. But by this time, the plague doctor was clearly more of an unsettling curiosity than a prevalent profession. As the Age of Enlightenment dawned and modern medicine developed, the old ways of the plague doctor slipped into the shadows of history. Their leather-cloaked forms and eerie masks largely vanished from the streets of Europe, relegated to the pages of storybooks and the nightmarish collective memory of the medieval world. But even as the living profession died out, the plague doctor persisted as a symbol, a chilling reminder of darker times when death walked openly among us. Their legacy remains as complex and layered as the mysterious potions and talismans they once carried from sickbed to mass grave. Part 9. Evaluating the plague doctor's legacy. Looking back from our modern medical vantage point, it's easy to dismiss the medieval plague doctor as a useless relic at best and a harmful fraud at worst. And to be sure, many of their methods, from bloodletting to mercury salves, likely caused far more suffering than healing. Desperate patients subjected themselves to all manner of gruesome and pointless treatments in the futile hope of cheating a deadly disease. Medical science was centuries from truly understanding. Yet one can also see the plague doctor, especially in those first apocalyptic waves of the Black Death, as a strangely noble figure doing what little they could in the face of unimaginable horror. Many were brave volunteers and low-ranking surgeons, risking their lives for civic duty, not just greedy charlatans or spotlight-seeking plague influencers. Some sources suggest the mortality rate for plague doctors was as high as 65%. It's unlikely their eerie outfits offered much real protection, beyond some vague sense of psychological distance. They lived with the constant terror of catching the pestilence themselves, and often did. Like many crisis profiteers across history, plague doctors occupied a morally murky realm between service and exploitation. The best of them acted from a sincere desire to tend the sick and conduct the difficult duties others shunned, like examining corpses and tracking the plague's spread. The worst were little better than resurrection men, looting the dead, or snake oil hucksters peddling false hope. Most plague doctors existed in the grey middle, scrambling to help as best they could while making a living from the only booming industry in a collapsing society. Were they courageous heroes or callous opportunists, genuine healers or costume frauds? The unsatisfying yet oddly fitting answer is yes. More than perhaps any other medical figure, the plague doctor symbolized the impotence and desperation of a humanity confronted by horrors beyond its control or comprehension. Despite all their education, experience, and arcane experiments, they could do virtually nothing to slow the relentless reaping of the plague. In an age of faith, even prayer seemed useless against such apocalyptic decimation. The sight of the plague doctor signaled to ailing patients that they were almost certainly doomed, if not from the disease, then from the grim masked figure stalking towards them. It's no wonder they endure as such a chilling spectre in our collective nightmares. Yet the plague doctors, in all their futility and strangeness, also embodied the undying human urge to confront our darkest fears and fight on against even the bleakest odds. They may have been wading into a battle they were certain to lose, with weapons almost as likely to harm as to heal. But wade in they did, with the same mixture of courage, persistence, and mortality, defying self-delusion that has inspired healers in every pandemic before and since. We may rightly condemn their methods while acknowledging the humanity behind them. The best plague doctors let themselves believe that donning that ominous outfit and marching into the miasmas might save a precious few lives, or at least console the dying. Sometimes the most meaningful medicine is the kind that dares to hope when hope seems lost. That complex legacy of failure and resilience, desperation and resolve, is what makes the plague doctor such an enduring and strangely compelling figure today. It's the same dark fascination that draws us to the frontline nurses and doctors of our modern pandemic times. Their faces concealed behind the PPE that has become our era's emblematic medical mask. The plague doctor reminds us of our own harrowing capacity for blindness and delusion in the midst of raging pestilence, and our stubborn, inspiring refusal to surrender to the void. They are at once a memento mori of life's precarity and a symbol of humanity's tenacity. Conclusion. Lessons from the plague doctor. In the end, perhaps the plague doctor endures because they remind us of our own modern selves, separated from the miasmic mysteries of the medieval world, yet still enthralled and terrified by the primal power of pandemic. Staring into the empty glass eyes of that beaked mask, we see reflected our own desperate scramble to combat COVID-19 and our own fitful progress against the invisible enemies that have stalked us since time immemorial. The differences in medical knowledge and technology, vast as they are, seem to collapse in the face of the eternal human realities of transmissible disease. The plague doctor's legacy whispers the same lesson our own pandemic has shouted anew, that despite all our scientific advances and elaborate social constructs, we remain far more vulnerable than we like to admit, that our bodies and our societies can unravel with startling speed when a malevolent microbe appears, that our vaunted knowledge is always a step behind nature's most devilish curveballs. The plague is the ultimate humbler. As one modern virologist put it, it reminds us, like the plague doctor's looming silhouette, of how little control we truly have. And yet, the plague doctor also symbolizes our indomitable capacity to fight on, however clumsily and imperfectly, against enemies we barely understand. They embodied the very human blend of fear and duty, superstition and science, helplessness and resolve that has marked medicine's eternal wrestle with infectious disease. From their flawed yet valiant efforts, we can draw inspiration to confront our own microbial nemeses with the same courage and persistence, even as we strive to avoid their worst mistakes. If the plague doctor was a symbol of medieval ignorance and suffering, they are also an icon of timeless human resilience and compassion. 500 years after the last plague doctor hung up their mask, we grapple with the same challenges that dogged them: the race for cures and containment, the arguments over lockdowns and liberty, the desperate improvisation and self-sacrificing service of doctors on harrowing front lines. Now as then, we are reminded that medicine, for all its technological triumphs, remains a deeply human endeavor bound up with culture and emotion as much as reason and science. Healers, then and now, are only as effective as the tools and theories available to them, and only as wise as the frightened, fragile societies they serve. So let us remember the plague doctor in all their haunting ambiguity, as a cautionary tale and an inspiration, an avatar of fatal ignorance and noble sacrifice, a mirror of our own halting struggle against the microscopic forces that have shaped human history more than any king or conqueror. They are a memento mori of life's tragic fragility in the face of untamable nature, and an icon of our stubborn refusal to submit to that cruel calculus. Most of all, they are an eternal reminder that even in our darkest, most diseased and death-haunted nights, there will always be those who take up the mask and dare to venture out to meet the pestilence head-on. As they did, so must we all. Part 6. Profiles of notable plague doctors. In the annals of history, a few plague doctors stand out for their unique stories and contributions during times of unimaginable crisis. One such figure was Michel de Nostradame, better known to the world as Nostradamus. Long before he gained renown as an astrologer and supposed seer, the young Frenchman worked as a plague doctor in the 1520s and 30s. Fresh from completing his medical studies at the University of Montpellier, Nostradamus began treating victims of the bubonic plague, first in his hometown of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, then in surrounding towns like Marseille and Aix-en-Provence. He threw himself into the fight against the dreaded pestilence, working tirelessly to heal the sick and comfort the dying. Rather than relying solely on the traditional treatments of bloodletting and purgatives, Nostradamus employed novel methods like promoting cleanliness, fresh air, and clean water. He formulated his own herbal remedies, including the famous rose pill, which contains such ingredients as rose hips, cypress, iris, and sawdust from green wood. While the efficacy of these concoctions is certainly questionable by modern standards, his tireless efforts and compassion were much appreciated by the communities he served. Local officials lauded him for his dedication, and he managed to survive the plague outbreaks himself, a testament to his knowledge of contagion prevention. Yet, the constant spectre of death and suffering undoubtedly took a psychological toll. In his later writings, there is a pervasive sense of melancholy and dark fascination with the occult and apocalyptic visions. One can imagine the horrors witnessed by the young plague doctor forever haunting the man who would become the infamous doomsday prophet. Another legendary plague doctor was the enigmatic figure known as Dr. Schnabel of Rome. Though little is known about his real identity or life story, he was immortalized in a famous 17th century German engraving, Der Dr. Schnabel von Rom, which depicts him in the iconic plague doctor outfit, complete with ominous beak-like mask. According to popular legend, Dr. Schnabel was a fearless and eccentric figure who took a highly unconventional approach to fighting the plague. The story goes that during a severe outbreak in Rome, he donned his waxed leather coat and beaked mask and set out to literally lure the plague out of the city. Wandering the narrow, fetid alleyways, Dr. Schnabel would call out to the pestilence, daring it to face him. With a lantern in one hand and a long stick in the other, he banged on doors and shutters, taunting the sickness. "Bring out your dead!" he is alleged to have shouted. "The doctor is here to cure you!" Whether the audacious Dr. Schnabel truly managed to draw the plague away, as the legend claims, is highly doubtful, but his story persisted as a source of grim fascination, a darkly humorous tale of one man's bold and bizarre attempt to confront the unconquerable. Not all plague doctors were such outsized personalities. Most were simply ordinary physicians or laymen doing their grim duty in harrowing times. One such figure was John of Burgundy, a 14th century French physician who left his mark on history not through wild tales or antics, but through his medical writings. In 1365, as the plague ravaged much of Europe, John of Burgundy published Treatise on the Epidemic, a practical guide for those treating plague victims. The work was notable for promoting the use of phlebotomy, or bleeding, as a primary treatment, along with detailed instructions for lancing and cauterizing the swollen buboes that were the plague's most horrific symptom. John also recommended a variety of medicines and tonics to be imbibed or applied topically. The most famous of these was the 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐴, a concoction that purported to be a universal antidote to poisons and disease. Often containing dozens of ingredients, from opium to viper flesh, 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐴 was a staple in the plague doctor's arsenal, even if its efficacy was questionable at best. Treatise on the Epidemic went on to become one of the most widely disseminated medical texts of the medieval era, reprinted numerous times over the following centuries. For better or worse, it helped establish some of the standard treatments used by plague doctors across Europe, cementing John of Burgundy's quiet but significant legacy. These profiles offer but a glimpse into the lives of the men behind the beaked masks. Some were learned physicians, some lay healers, some outright charlatans and profiteers, but they were all united by the grim duty they performed in the face of a terrible foe. Each, in their own way, represents a facet of the enduring legend of the plague doctor, at once a symbol of selfless service and sinister pseudoscience, a dark and captivating figure who still haunts the human imagination. Part 7. The Plague Doctor in Art and Literature. For centuries after the Black Death faded into history, the spectre of the Plague Doctor endured in European art and literature. With their ominous beaked masks, long black coats, and aura of death, these grim figures became iconic symbols of pestilence and human frailty. In the world of visual art, plague doctors frequently appeared as dark, haunting presences in scenes of suffering and lamentation. One of the earliest and most famous examples is the Triumph of Death, a 15th century fresco by Italian artist Buonamico Buffalmacco. Painted on the walls of the Camposanto Monumentale cemetery in Pisa, the unsettling work depicts the devastating impact of the Black Death. Amidst the piles of corpses and wailing survivors, a menacing figure in a black hood and beaked mask emerges, unmistakably a plague doctor. He points an accusing finger at a group of young noblemen and women, as if to say that death comes for rich and poor alike. This motif of the plague doctor as a kind of grim reaper, an emissary of mortality, recurs throughout medieval and Renaissance art. Another famous artistic trope involving plague doctors is the danse macabre, or dance of death. A common allegorical genre in the late Middle Ages, the danse macabre depicts figures from all walks of life: kings, popes, peasants, children, being led in a grim promenade to the grave by skeletal personifications of death. In many of these eerie scenes, plague doctors make an appearance, their unsettling masks and garb adding to the overall atmosphere of horror and inevitability. One notable example is Matthäus Merian's 1649 engraving, which shows a beaked plague doctor joining the procession of the doomed, holding aloft an hourglass to signify the fleeting nature of life. But it wasn't just in the visual arts that plague doctors cast their long shadow. They also stalked the pages of literature across the centuries. In the 14th century, Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of novellas set against the backdrop of the Black Death in Florence. While the plague doctor is not a central figure in these bawdy and satirical tales, they do make occasional appearances, usually as symbols of the futility of human efforts against divine punishment. In one memorable passage, Boccaccio describes the plague doctors as men who did naught but go about with spices and medicaments, the stench whereof was of itself sufficient to have occasioned sickness to any that scented it. Centuries later, the plague doctor would emerge as a chilling character in the works of Gothic and horror writers. In Edgar Allan Poe's bleak short story, The Masque of the Red Death, a mysterious figure in a habiliment of the grave, with a mask made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, crashes a decadent masquerade ball as pestilence devastates the land outside. While not explicitly identified as a plague doctor, the eerie stranger bears all the hallmarks of the iconic outfit, serving as an avatar of the inescapable contagion. Through Poe's blood-tinted lens, the plague doctor becomes a malevolent supernatural presence, an embodiment of death itself. British author Daniel Defoe also deployed plague doctor imagery to great effect in A Journal of the Plague Year, his fictionalized account of the Great Plague of London in 1665. Defoe describes the frightful sight of plague doctors stalking about in their black cloaks, masks, gloves and instruments, sowing fear and despair wherever they went. Yet Defoe also acknowledges the courage and self-sacrifice of those who tended to the infected, writing, "But it must be confessed that the charity of the physicians was very great. They ventured their lives to an extreme and lost their lives by it in a most terrible manner." In Defoe's telling, the plague doctor is both a spectre of death and a heroic martyr, a fitting encapsulation of their complex and contradictory legacy. From the grim frescoes of the Campo Santo to the blood-soaked pages of Poe, the plague doctor has long captured the darkest corners of the human imagination. Even as the real-life plague doctors faded into history, their macabre legend lived on, preserved in the amber of countless paintings, prints, and stories. Their enduring hold on our collective psyche speaks to the way they embodied the deepest of human fears, of suffering, of powerlessness, of death itself. Forever frozen in their eerie beaked masks and black robes, the plague doctor remains a chilling memento mori, an eternal reminder of the precariousness of life and the horrors that once stalked the earth. Part 8. The Decline of the Plague Doctor. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the golden age of the plague doctor began to wane. the frequency and severity of outbreaks gradually declined, due in part to improvements in sanitation and quarantine practices, as well as the natural waxing and waning of the disease itself. With fewer epidemics to battle, the demand for specialized plague doctors decreased. At the same time, the medical theories and treatments that had long underpinned the plague doctor's craft were coming under increasing scrutiny. The ancient Greek system of humoral medicine, which held that illness resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids, was slowly giving way to new ideas based on empirical observation and scientific experimentation. One of the most vocal critics of traditional plague medicine was the Swiss physician Paracelsus. A controversial figure known for his iconoclastic views and fiery temperament, Paracelsus rejected the orthodoxies of Galenic medicine, including the use of bleeding and purging to restore humoral balance. He argued that diseases had specific causes that could be treated with targeted remedies, rather than the catch-all cures favored by many plague doctors. While Paracelsus himself died long before the heyday of the plague doctor, his ideas helped pave the way for a more modern, scientific approach to medicine. As the old ways came under fire, many of the treatments employed by plague doctors were increasingly discredited. The use of 𝐒𝐤𝐿, the supposed wonder drug that had been a staple of the plague doctor's arsenal for centuries, was particularly lambasted. Critics pointed out that the concoction, with its dizzying array of ingredients from opium to viper flesh, was essentially useless against the plague, if not actively harmful. Other common plague doctor practices, like bloodletting and induced vomiting, also fell out of favour as their ineffectiveness and potential dangers became apparent. The iconic plague doctor costume itself, with its ominous beaked mask and waxed leather coat, was ridiculed as a relic of a superstitious and ignorant age. Yet even as the plague doctor's star faded in Western Europe, they lingered on in some parts of the world. In the more remote reaches of Eastern Europe and Russia, where outbreaks of bubonic plague continued to flare up sporadically, plague doctors could still be found plying their trade well into the 19th century. One of the last recorded plague doctors was a Russian by the name of Danilo Samoilovich, who battled outbreaks in the Ukraine and Crimea in the 1780s. Samoilovich was a forward-thinking physician who rejected many of the old superstitions surrounding the plague. He promoted the use of quarantine and sanitation measures, and even conducted early experiments with a form of inoculation, using dried pustule matter from plague victims. Yet even as Samoilovich worked to modernize plague medicine, he still clung to some of the trappings of the traditional plague doctor. He was known to wear a modified version of the beaked mask and protective clothing, and he subscribed to the theory that the plague was spread by miasmas, or noxious vapors. In many ways, Samoilovich embodied the complex legacy of the plague doctor, a figure caught between the old world and the new, straddling the line between superstition and science. As the 19th century dawned, men like Samoilovich would be among the last to wear the beaked mask and black robes that had once struck such fear and awe into the hearts of the afflicted. But even as the living practice faded into history, the plague doctor endured as a powerful visual and cultural symbol. The eerie spectre of the beaked mask and black coat became permanently lodged in the European imagination, a shorthand for the horrors of pestilence and the ravages of death. In our modern age, with its advanced medical knowledge and sophisticated public health systems, it can be hard to fathom the world of the plague doctor. Their methods may seem primitive, even barbaric to our eyes. Yet in their time, these haunting figures represented the front lines of a desperate battle against a pitiless foe. Though their remedies were often useless and their theories misguided, the plague doctors were the ones who ventured into the heart of the hot zone, the ones who faced the dread disease on its own turf. For that courage and sacrifice, if nothing else, they deserve our respect and remembrance. So let us spare a thought for the men behind the beaked masks, the learned physicians and lowly barber surgeons, the opportunistic quacks and selfless heroes. Theirs was a grim and thankless trade, but one that forever left its mark on human history. In the annals of medicine and the imagination of the world, the plague doctor will always have a haunting, hallowed place. Part 9. Evaluating the plague doctor's legacy. Looking back on the long, grim history of the plague doctor, it's easy to view them as little more than a morbid curiosity. A bizarre footnote in the annals of medicine, notable more for their eerie appearance than any lasting contribution. And it's true that, by modern standards, their methods were largely ineffective, even counterproductive. Bloodletting, purging, and the application of dubious poultices likely did little to alleviate the suffering of their patients, and may have even hastened their demise. Yet to dismiss the plague doctors as mere quacks or charlatans would be to do them a disservice. Given the state of medical knowledge in their time, they were working with the best tools and theories available to them. The miasma theory of disease, which held that illnesses were spread by noxious vapors, was widely accepted by learned physicians of the day, and treatments like bleeding and induced vomiting, while misguided, were rooted in the ancient Galenic tradition that had dominated Western medicine for centuries. Moreover, it's important to remember the sheer scale of the crisis that the plague doctors were up against. The Black Death was a pandemic of unimaginable devastation, one that wiped out a third of Europe's population in just a few short years. In the face of such overwhelming horror, it's remarkable that the plague doctors managed to muster any response at all. In fact, the very existence of the plague doctor as a specialized profession speaks to a certain resilience and resourcefulness in medieval society. The idea that cities and towns would hire dedicated medical personnel to treat plague victims at a time when most people had little access to formal health care was a significant development. It shows that even in the darkest of times, there was still a flicker of hope, a determination to fight back against the ravages of disease. Of course, not all plague doctors were equally noble or self-sacrificing. As with any profession, there were undoubtedly those who were more interested in personal gain than patient care. The fact that many plague doctors were essentially independent contractors, hired on short-term deals with little oversight, undoubtedly attracted some unscrupulous characters looking to make a quick florin. There are accounts of plague doctors overcharging for their services, or peddling useless nostrums to desperate patients. Some even used their position to rob the homes of the dead and dying. In the chaos and desperation of a plague outbreak, it's not hard to imagine how such abuses could occur. Yet for every bad apple, there were surely many more plague doctors who were genuinely trying to do their best in an impossible situation. We know from contemporary records that some plague doctors worked tirelessly to treat the sick, often at great personal risk. They faced not only the danger of infection, but also the psychological toll of constantly confronting death and suffering on a massive scale. Some, like the famed Nostradamus, even turned to unorthodox methods like promoting cleanliness and fresh air in an attempt to combat the disease. While these measures were not enough to halt the plague in its tracks, they do suggest a certain progressive spirit, a willingness to think beyond the conventional wisdom. Perhaps the most fitting testament to the plague doctor's legacy is the fact that even today, they endure as a potent symbol in our collective imagination. The image of the bee. The plague doctor's legacy endured long after the Black Death faded into history. In the centuries that followed, these eerie figures continued to haunt the European imagination, appearing again and again in art, literature, and folklore. One of the most famous artistic representations of the plague doctor comes from the 15th century danse macabre genre. These morbid, yet fascinating works, often found in churches and graveyards, depicted the skeletal figure of death, leading people from all walks of life in a ghoulish dance. Among the doomed procession, one can often spot the unmistakable beak-masked visage of a plague doctor, a chilling reminder of the era's ever-present spectre of disease and mortality. The plague doctor also stalks the pages of literature across the centuries. In the 14th century, Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio set his classic work, The Decameron, during a plague outbreak, weaving vivid descriptions of the futile ministrations of plague doctors into his tragicomic tales. Centuries later, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year and Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death would feature memorable cameos by these ominous figures. But perhaps the plague doctor's most enduring role has been as a visual symbol, a simple yet striking image that conveys volumes about the Black Death and medieval medicine. From woodcuts to engravings to modern-day Halloween costumes, the sight of that grim, beaked silhouette instantly conjures up thoughts of pestilence, dread, and the macabre. It has become a kind of visual shorthand for the horrors of the past. Yet even as the plague doctor became entrenched in the popular imagination, the actual practice of specialized plague medicine gradually faded away. By the 17th century, outbreaks of the bubonic plague had become less frequent and less severe across much of Europe. At the same time, the plague doctor's methods, from bloodletting to theriac, were increasingly discredited by new medical thinkers like Paracelsus and Vesalius, who began to question the ancient Greek humoral theories that underpinned so much of medieval medicine. To be sure, a few plague doctors still plied their trade into the 18th and even 19th centuries, particularly in the more remote reaches of Eastern Europe. But by and large, these once ubiquitous figures had disappeared from the streets and sick rooms of European towns and cities. The age of the plague doctor had passed. Looking back from the vantage point of the modern world, it can be difficult to pass judgment on these enigmatic figures. On one hand, it's impossible to deny the profound limitations and outright failures of the plague doctor's methods. For all their efforts, they saved precious few lives and may have helped spread disease in some cases. Seen in this light, they seem to be little more than misguided meddlers, peddlers of false hope and fatal remedies. Yet at the same time, there is something undeniably noble and brave about the plague doctor's willingness to confront an unspeakable horror again and again, armed with little more than specious theories and makeshift protective gear. In an age when many physicians fled plague-stricken areas in droves, these curious men chose to stay and fight, to face down the Reaper in his own domain. That takes a special kind of courage, however misguided. Perhaps in the end, the plague doctor's legacy is neither that of a hero nor a villain, but something more complicated and more human. They were both selfless servants and slightly sinister opportunists, both guardians of life and harbingers of death. In many ways, they embodied the full spectrum of human nature during times of existential crisis, our capacity for altruism and avarice, for bravery and blunder, for determination and despair. And there may be lessons for our own time in the plague doctor's long, strange history. Today, as new pandemic threats like COVID-19 stalk the globe, we find ourselves grappling with many of the same challenges and conundrums that confronted our medieval forebears. We too are searching for cures and containment, for explanations and scapegoats. We too have our valiant frontline medics and our questionable quacks and profiteers. Most of all, perhaps, the plague doctor reminds us of our own fragility in the face of unfathomable catastrophe. For all our modern scientific and medical prowess, we remain deeply vulnerable to the whims of nature, to the ravages of disease. In times like these, the beaked mask begins to feel less like a historical relic and more like a mirror, reflecting back our own deepest anxieties about death, disorder, and the unknown. Yet even in the darkest days of the Black Death, humanity endured. People found small moments of joy, connection, and resilience amidst oceans of suffering. Today, as we don our own masks and confront our own invisible enemy, we would do well to remember that, because in the end, That may be the plague doctor's most enduring lesson. Not how to cure disease, but how to survive it with our humanity intact. And so the plague doctor takes their place in the annals of medical history. A complicated and captivating figure who still speaks to us across the centuries. A symbol of both the best and worst in human nature, of our unending battle against the spectre of death and disease. Though their beak mask and black cloak may seem alien and unsettling to our modern eyes, there is something strangely familiar about their story, something that echoes in our own time of pandemic and uncertainty. As we lay our heads down to sleep, perhaps we might spare a thought for these long ago men and women who stared into the abyss of the Black Death and did not look away, who fought a futile battle against an implacable foe, armed with little more than faith, folklore, and a macabre fashion sense. Flawed and fallible as they were, there is a certain dark nobility in their doomed crusade. So let us bid good night to the plague doctors of old, secure in the knowledge that their strange and haunting story is not entirely a thing of the past. For as long as humanity faces the ancient enemy of pestilence, we will need courageous healers and seekers, however imperfect, to take up the fight anew. And in that sense, perhaps a part of the plague doctor lives on in us all, a grim but necessary reminder of our endless dance with death and disease. Lancing buboes was a common if grisly practice for plague doctors. A bubo is a swollen, painful lymph node, most often in the groin, neck, or armpit. During the Black Death, these grotesque buboes could grow to the size of apples. In the medieval humour system, plague doctors believed buboes were the body's attempt to expel excess blood and bad humours. Their solution was often to slice open the bubo with a razor to drain the foul substance. Some even used specially designed lancing tools and cupping glasses. It was a brutal procedure, painful, messy, and unsanitary. Patients screamed in agony as the plague doctor dug into their inflamed flesh. Of course, we know now this accomplished little. Buboes are a symptom of the bacterial infection, not the cause. Lancing them provided no real relief and likely spread the contagion further. But to the plague doctor, steeped in miasma theory and Galenic medicine, purging foul matter from buboes seemed the logical response to a disease believed to arise from internal imbalances and rot. After draining a bubo, the plague doctor might pack the open wound with salves or poultices made from herbs, minerals, breads, even animal dung. A popular treatment was 𝐶𝐢𝐴𝐴, a concoction of dozens of ingredients from viper flesh to opium, honey to cinnamon. It was prescribed as a cure-all for everything from indigestion to the plague itself, though really it probably just numbed the patient into a drowsy haze. If buboes failed to appear, plague doctors took an even more aggressive approach, slicing into the flesh to essentially create an artificial bubo. The hope was drawing out bad blood near an infection site, like in the armpit. It's sobering to imagine the plague doctor hunched over a patient, bloodletting them to the point of collapse, all while believing this was the height of medical intervention. For the sickest patients, unable to endure any more cutting and draining, the plague doctor might resort to extreme measures bordering on folk magic, applying live chickens or pigeons to buboes, smearing snake oil on the skin, brewing potions of ground unicorn horns and powdered gems, all while smoke from the ever-burning beak mask stung their eyes. There was likely no consolation or bedside manner. Plague doctors were discouraged from conversation with their patients lest they inhale the deadly miasmas. At most, they might offer last rites or scrawl talismanic symbols. For most, the looming plague doctor was the grim face of a losing battle, the final spectre before their disease ran its fatal course. Nostradamus, the famed French astrologer and seer, endured these harrowing conditions in his early career as a plague doctor. As a young man in the 1520s, he travelled through Provence, treating the afflicted. It's estimated he tended to hundreds of plague victims at great personal risk. One wonders what sights and horrors those eyes beheld, peering out from that eerie beaked mask. Did the great prophet foresee his own destiny, a life of fame and legend? Or in those grim days, did the world seem a meaningless carnival of suffering, with death playing a mocking tune? What we know is that Nostradamus emerged from the ordeal with a reputation as a skilled and selfless doctor. He even wrote a handbook called Traité des Fardements, detailing his hard-earned methods and remedies. His experiences also shaped his view of fate and the supernatural, the idea that unseen forces move human affairs, be they the stars above or the pestilence within. For the plague doctor, it must have been a surreal existence, trapped between the dying and the dead, the earthly and the otherworldly. They stalked the hazy borders of the known, a lonely figure fighting a metaphysical battle as much as a medical one. Steeped in sickness and dread, did some turn to mysticism, alchemy, and the occult out of desperation? Or as a source of grim comfort in a world unraveled by pestilence? Such was the strange mental and spiritual landscape of the medieval plague doctor, ministering at the edges of natural philosophy and morbid superstition, saturated in disease and death, confronting the limits of mortal understanding. Is it any wonder so many slipped into fatalism, madness, or magical thinking? After all, the plague seemed to obey no law of nature, erupting from the mists to decimate princes and peasants alike, before receding into the shadows. Perhaps we can forgive the plague doctors their bloodletting and fumigations, their talismans and potions. They fought the unforgiving fight with the only weapons their world had given them: ancient texts, folk traditions, a doctor's mask, and simple human perseverance. Though they retreated further behind bizarre rituals and costumes, they still marched out to greet the Grim Reaper day after day, an army of Hippocrates meeting the apocalyptic horseman head-on. What emerges is a figure both unsettling and oddly heroic, a mirror held up to humanity's eternal struggle against the void. Their life was a dance macabre, a final waltz with oblivion. And though the age of the plague doctor has long passed, their spirit echoes through the centuries, a memento mori of the healer's burden and the fragility of flesh and blood. So let us give this strange spectre their due, not as saviour or charlatan, but as flawed avatar of all who would defy death. They stood on the precipice of the Black Death and fought it the only way they knew. Their silhouette endures, eerie, tragic, darkly captivating, a shadow from a distant century, but one that still haunts the edges of our own. Part 4. Medical Beliefs and Treatments. As the plague doctor made his solemn rounds through the afflicted village, his attentions turned to the grim work of treatment. In an age before germ theory and modern medical science, the battle against pestilence was often a desperate struggle in the dark. The plague doctor, like most physicians of his era, practiced within the framework of the ancient Greek humoral theory of medicine. This venerable system, handed down from the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, held that the human body was governed by 4 cardinal fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. In a healthy body, these humours existed in perfect balance. But when a humoral excess or deficiency occurred, the result was sickness and disease. The plague doctor's treatments, however strange and appalling they may appear to modern eyes, aimed to restore this delicate equilibrium. The most common weapon in the plague doctor's arsenal was bloodletting. Since antiquity, bleeding had been seen as an effective means to drain corrupt or excessive humours from the body. The plague doctor might open a vein in the arm or apply leeches to draw out the tainted blood. More aggressive bleeding targeted specific areas, like the neck, to treat the buboes that so tormented the afflicted. In a time without anaesthetic, one can only imagine the added anguish these gory ministrations inflicted on the suffering patient. Another favoured practice was the lancing of the buboes. The plague doctor would pierce and drain these grotesque swellings, thought to be concentrations of putrefied humours. The resulting wounds would then be cauterized with a red-hot iron, or treated with an ointment of honey, garlic, and onion. For many, the agony of the cure rivaled that of the disease itself. Alongside these surgical horrors, the plague doctor also plied an array of potions, tonics, and unguents. Many aimed to induce vigorous purging, whether by sweating, vomiting, or diarrhea. The idea was to expel the noxious humours from the body by any means necessary. One popular preparation was 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐽𝐴, a concoction containing dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, and myrrh. Though costly and complex to prepare, 𝐒𝐤𝐴𝐽𝐴 was hailed as a cure-all for poison and pestilence. Apothecaries did a brisk business concocting these dubious remedies. Gentler palliatives, like rosewater, violets, and comfrey root, were prescribed to soothe fevers and restore strength. But in truth, few of these preparations offered more than fleeting comfort against the ravages of the plague. Perhaps sensing the limits of their art, many plague doctors resorted to more metaphysical methods. They burned aromatic herbs like rosemary and frankincense, hoping the fragrant smoke would banish the pestilent miasmas. Holy relics and blessed amulets were placed on the afflicted, entreating divine intercession. Incantations and ritual gestures borrowed from folk magic and religious rite were performed over the sick and dying. Faced with the Black Death, a horror beyond human reckoning, the plague doctor marshalled every weapon at his command, from the cutting edge of medieval medicine to the deepest wells of superstition. In the flickering candlelight of the sick room, the boundaries between science, religion, and occultism blurred. The plague doctor fought as best he could, with all the tools of body, mind, and spirit. But too often, his best was not enough. The humoral treatments, for all their sound and fury, offered little more than false hope in most cases. The buboes still erupted, the fevers still raged, and the afflicted slipped away into the long, dark night of death. The plague doctor could only watch, helpless behind his ominous mask, as another soul passed beyond reach of his dubious cures. It is perhaps little wonder that the plague doctor became such a hated and dreaded figure. To the sick, he represented torment heaped upon torment, a grim reaper of bloodletting and boil lancing. To the healthy, he was an omen of doom, a walking reminder that none were safe from the pestilence. In a world unravelled by unimaginable calamity, the plague doctor was both a desperate hope and an avatar of deepest fears. As the doctor left the humble cottage and walked into the gloaming, his footsteps were dogged by the weeping of the bereaved and the groans of the afflicted. How many more would he treat tonight, only to consign to the flames come dawn? How long before the pestilence burned itself out, or consumed them all in its insatiable maw? These were questions without answers, in a time when the old certainties had crumbled to ash. The plague doctor could only continue his grim work, hoping that his efforts might save a precious few. In a dark time beyond human understanding, this was perhaps the most that any mortal could do. Part 5. The life of a plague doctor. To be a plague doctor in a medieval city was to inhabit a world of perpetual twilight and looming shadow. Each day brought a relentless procession of the sick, the dying, and the dead. From dawn until dusk, and often deep into the haunted watches of the night, the plague doctor made his solemn rounds. His was a life of ceaseless toil and harrowing personal risk. While his macabre costume offered some meagre protection, every visit to an infected household, every examination of a plague-ridden body, invited peril. The plague doctor lived in constant fear that the very air he breathed, tainted by miasmas, might convey the pestilence into his own lungs. A plague doctor's day began with a visit to the town's alderman or health committee. Here he would receive his list of patients and his stipend, a princely sum that recognized the dangers of his work. Girded in his ominous regalia, he would set out into the labyrinth of narrow, winding streets. As he walked, the city's surviving inhabitants would shrink from him, turning their faces or making the sign of the cross. To them, the doctor's looming silhouette had become a chilling portent, an unwelcome herald of suffering and loss. Even children would flee at the sight of his beaked visage, his black cloak billowing in the fetid breeze. At each afflicted house, the plague doctor would pause, steeling himself before the horrors within. He would assess the suffering victims, examine the buboes, dispense his meager physic. If the patient had died in the night, he would inspect the ravaged body, searching for signs that might shed light on the disease's hellish workings. More than a physician, the plague doctor was also an agent of public order in a city besieged by chaos. He would direct the boarding up of infected houses, ordering the dread quarantine. He oversaw the disposal of the dead and the burning of their contaminated belongings. His work was a bulwark against the disintegration of civilized life itself. As the day wore on into darkness, the doctor would return to the health committee to make his report. The names of the dead would be duly recorded, the progress of the pestilence charted with a heavy hand. Then it was off into the night again, to check on critical cases or answer some fresh cry of lamentation. The emotional and psychological toll of such a life can hardly be overstated. To be surrounded by constant suffering, to daily don the mantle of a spectre of death, exacted a grim price. In the journals and letters that survive from these dark times, we catch glimpses of plague doctors grappling with the enormity of their task. Some turned to drink, losing themselves in the temporary oblivion of wine or ale. Others sought solace in piety, spending what few free hours remained in fervent prayer. Gallows humour, that ancient refuge of those in proximate peril, was a common coping mechanism. Plague doctors became known for their macabre jests and grim witticisms. A few rare souls even found a kind of resolute purpose in the crucible of the crisis. They saw their work, for all its futility and horror, as a sacred calling. In tending to the afflicted, in bearing witness to suffering, they found a higher meaning. Even as they walked through the valley of the shadow of death, they committed themselves to the service of their fellow man. But for most, the life of a plague doctor was a trial beyond human endurance. Many lasted only a few months before succumbing to exhaustion, despair, or the pestilence itself. They joined the legions of the dead, their beaked masks and black cloaks no protection against the ravages of the plague. And yet, for as long as the city's silver continued to find its way into trembling palms, there were always more to take up the grim work. In a time when all social bonds were frayed to the breaking point, when all hope seemed lost in a sea of suffering, there would be plague doctors. Through the worst of the medieval world's darkest hours, these haunting figures endured, part physician, part priest, part reaper, steadfast in the face of the unspeakable. As the sun set over the medieval city, an eerie figure emerged from the shadows. Clad head to toe in black oilcloth, with a wide-brimmed hat and a long beak-like mask, the plague doctor struck a chilling silhouette against the fading light. To the frightened citizens, huddled in their homes, praying to be spared from pestilence, this ominous spectre represented both their last hope and their worst fear. For the plague doctor himself, it was another long night of confronting the deadliest disease in human history. The life of a medieval plague doctor was one of unimaginable horror, hardship, and heartbreak. Armed with little more than ancient medical theories, superstitious remedies, and a macabre sense of duty, These grim figures ventured into the very heart of the Black Death to treat the sick and bear witness to the suffering. It was a role that demanded equal parts bravery and desperation. As many plague doctors were simply untested physicians, failed academics, or even common charlatans looking to profit from the pandemonium. But for the true doctors who answered the call, like Charles Delorme, the French physician often credited with inventing the iconic plague doctor outfit, it was a higher calling. In 1619, as the bubonic plague ravaged Paris, Delorme designed an ensemble intended to protect the wearer from the deadly miasmas believed to spread the disease. The long leather coat was waxed for repelling noxious fluids, while the beak-like mask could be stuffed with straw, herbs, and spices to filter the foul air. Completing the outfit were leather breeches, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed leather hat that signified the doctor's profession. In this foreboding garb, the plague doctor would set out to examine the infected and administer what limited treatments the era could provide. Working from the ancient Greek theory of bodily humours, plague doctors sought to rebalance the blood, phlegm, and bile through aggressive and often gruesome means. Bloodletting, lancing buboes, forced purgatives, and foul-smelling poultices were the order of the day. Just as often, the plague doctor would resort to more superstitious fare, like magical amulets, chanted spells, and copious amounts of theriac, a cure-all concoction containing viper flesh and opium. The sheer gruesomeness and futility of such treatments is almost unfathomable to the modern mind. Imagine you are a medieval plague victim, huddled on a squalid cot, feverish and racked with pain from the swollen buboes in your armpits and groin. The shadowy plague doctor looms over you, his beaked visage, like some terrible bird of carrion, come to claim your soul. With dispassionate resolve, he slices open your buboes to drain the foul black pus. The searing pain is eclipsed only by the stench of putrid infection. As your lifeblood oozes out, the doctor forces a vile tonic down your throat, chanting strange invocations. Your last thought, as darkness takes you, is that you have descended into hell. For the plague doctor himself, such harrowing scenes were a daily reality. The journals and records that survive from the era paint a grim picture of their lot. Nostradamus, the famed French astrologer and prophet, began his career as a plague doctor in the 1520s. For years, he travelled through France and Italy, treating the infected and studying the disease. His first-hand accounts speak of entire towns decimated, bodies piled in the streets, and a constant, oppressive spectre of death. I do not think that in the whole world there remained a single man who had not tasted the sadness and terror of the plague, he wrote. Other plague doctors coped with the unrelenting horror through more earthly vices. Many contemporary reports decried their fondness for drink, gambling, and lascivious behaviour. The famous engraving of Dr. Schnabel of Rome, an iconic image of the plague doctor, shows him carousing in a tavern, his beaked mask askew as he drunkenly regales the patrons with morbid tales. Such conduct may seem reprehensible, but for men confronted daily with the depths of human suffering, it was often the only way to retain some semblance of sanity. As the Black Death raged across Europe, claiming millions of lives, the plague doctor became an increasingly common and chilling sight. In art and literature, he emerged as a grim symbol of the era's mortality and dread. The famous danse macabre genre, which depicted skeletons leading townsfolk in a morbid jig, frequently featured the plague doctor among the revelers. Manuscript illustrations, woodcuts, and memento mori engravings portrayed him as the sardonic emissary of death, ushering the afflicted towards their grisly end with a bony finger. This morbid artistic fascination persisted long after the plague itself abated. In the centuries that followed, the plague doctor became a stock character of the Gothic imagination, appearing in the works of Poe, Shelley, and Dickens as a sinister spectre haunting the shadowy fringes of civilization. Even today, his unsettling image endures as the preeminent icon of the Black Death, a reminder of the horrors our ancestors faced in the face of unimaginable catastrophe. For those who bore the mantle of the Plague Doctor, however, there was little glamour or glory to be found. Despite their ominous attire and aura of arcane knowledge, the vast majority of plague doctors were hideously unequipped to combat a disease that laid waste to empires. Their treatments, though born of earnest intention, often only added to the suffering of their patients. Many fell victim to the plague themselves, their waxed coats and beaked masks offering scant protection against the horrors they battled. And yet, for all their grim futility, it's hard not to feel a pang of admiration for these dark knights of the Middle Ages. In a time when even kings and bishops fled before the onslaught of the plague, the doctors donned their beaked masks and marched grimly into the fray. They confronted the living nightmare of their age with little more than folk wisdom, blind faith, and a stalwart sense of duty. Though they laboured in the shadow of death, there was a nobility to their calling, a stubborn humanity that not even the ravages of pestilence could extinguish. As the Plague Doctor faded from history, supplanted by the Age of Reason and the advent of modern medicine, his haunting spectre lived on in art and imagination. The beaked mask and black cloak became the stuff of morbid fascination, a grim reminder of the horrors our forebears weathered in times of plague. Today, we look back on the medieval Plague Doctor as a tragic, enigmatic figure, part monster, part martyr, a symbol of both the darkness of the age and the indomitable human spirit. In our own times, as new pandemics rear their ugly heads and the spectre of global contagion looms large, the lessons of the Plague Doctor seem more relevant than ever. We too are confronted with a faceless, implacable foe that threatens to upend our way of life. We too must grapple with the limits of our knowledge, the shortcomings of our institutions, and the stark realities of our own mortality. And like the Plague Doctors of old, we must summon the courage to confront the unthinkable, to stare down the abyss with unwavering resolve. Perhaps in the end, that is the true legacy of the Plague Doctor. Not the grim visage or the grisly treatments, but the indomitable spirit of compassion and selflessness in the face of overwhelming despair. As we don our own masks and gowns and venture out into an uncertain world, we would do well to remember the example of these dark heroes of history. For in their haunted eyes, we may just catch a glimpse of our own reflection, fragile, fearful, but forever unbowed in the face of the dark. The Plague Doctor may belong to the shadows of the past, but his lessons endure in the hearts of all who have ever stood against the tide of pestilence and death. As we lay our heads down to sleep, let us dream not of his grim countenance, but of the quiet courage he embodied in times of unimaginable strife. For in that courage, we may yet find the strength to face the dark and awaken to a brighter dawn. Part 9. Evaluating the Plague Doctor's legacy. In evaluating the legacy of the medieval Plague Doctor, we must acknowledge both their limited effectiveness, given the state of medicine at the time, and their immense bravery in combating one of history's deadliest pandemics. These enigmatic figures, clad in their eerie beak-like masks and long black cloaks, charged fearlessly into infected homes and pestilence-ridden streets, day after day. Armed with little more than a smattering of ancient Greek medical theories, superstitious folklore, and a handful of crude instruments, they faced the Black Death head-on. While plague doctors undoubtedly saved some lives through trial and error, recommending quarantines and basic sanitation, their cures were often ineffective at best and harmful at worst. Bloodletting, induced vomiting, and toxic potions likely hastened the demise of many a desperate patient. And yet, in an age of overwhelming dread and despair, The arrival of the plague doctor also represented a final glimmer of hope for the suffering masses. In many ways, these haunting figures embodied both the best and worst of how humans confront unimaginable crises. On one hand, plague doctors voluntarily waded into some of the darkest, most traumatic circumstances imaginable, offering care and comfort to the sick while risking their own lives. In an era when many physicians simply fled in terror, this selfless service in the face of horror was undeniably valiant. And yet, like controversial figures such as grave robbing, resurrection men, and traveling snake oil salesmen, plague doctors could also callously exploit people's desperation. Some made wild promises, peddled expensive cure-alls, or conducted disturbing experiments on dying patients with little oversight. This quackery and fatalism reveals the uglier side of human nature, the unscrupulous opportunism and magical thinking that can fester in times of fear. In the end, perhaps the plague doctor's checkered legacy is a testament to the incredible fragility and resilience of the human spirit in the face of pandemic chaos. They were ultimately little more than a ragtag mix of educated physicians, ambitious apprentices, wandering charlatans, and everyday people thrust into the role by pure necessity. They wore the guise of authority and expertise, while stumbling blindly through the miasmic fog of a medical catastrophe. And yet for the sick, dying and despairing, the mere presence of these ominous figures, their arrival on the doorstep, beaked mask and black cloak billowing, offered one final shred of dignity and hope before the end. For they represented the unshakable human conviction that even against all odds, even in the face of agonizing suffering and mass death, we must always strive to heal and to care. Conclusion. Lessons from the plague doctor. As we reflect on the haunting spectre of the plague doctor, that iconic symbol of the Black Death, what deeper lessons might we draw about the human condition? At its core, their story speaks to the eternal human struggle to confront the horrors of epidemic disease and mortality. Across the centuries, from the bubonic plague to smallpox to COVID-19, we have turned to medicine, faith, ritual, and even superstition to soothe our primal fears of contagion and death. The plague doctor's eerie silhouette reminds us of our own fragility in an indifferent universe, how all our knowledge and sophistication can crumble before the humbling onslaught of nature's tiniest microbes. And yet, just as those haunted medieval streets once again return to the cycles and rhythms of life, humanity endures. Civilizations fall, pandemics rage, and yet we greet the dawn, scour our textbooks and laboratories, rebuild our cities. In our own time, as new pandemic threats revive old fears and debates, we might look beyond the plague doctor's primitive missteps and macabre failures. For even through the murkiest nights of uncertainty and despair, these obscure figures stood their ground. They lit a candle in the dark. They showed up for thankless and seemingly impossible work, armed with little more than a sense of duty, a whisper of hope. Who are the plague doctors of our modern age? The ordinary heroes throwing themselves between the vulnerable and oblivion. What will future generations remember, rightly or wrongly, about our own doctors on the pandemic front lines? Our public health soldiers waging nightly battle against nature's invisible armies. Will they be honoured for their selfless service and sacrifice, or criticised for their shortcomings and blind spots? Perhaps some truths are eternal. In times of historic crisis, when panic, grief, and disorder reign, we seek out symbols to project our deepest hopes and fears. And what could be more darkly captivating than the plague doctor, that grim reaper made flesh, stalking through our fevered nightmares and crowded sick rooms, medicine and mortality intertwined. They are Charon on the river Styx, Virgil descending into the inferno, an usher to the underworld. And yet, we must recognize the human behind the beaked mask, the trembling hand, the weary tread, the everyday bravery of simply showing up. So let us honor these medieval medics, even as we coolly dissect their faults and frailties. Let them remind us always of our shared vulnerability and resilience, our perpetual struggle to light those candles in our long, dark night. The next time you see that chilling silhouette on the pages of a dusty chronicle, in the shadows of a hallowed museum, or the digital halls of a late-night YouTube deep dive, take a moment to reflect, for you are gazing into a mirror of the human condition, an eternal tableau of suffering and succor, hubris and humility, despair and determination. And now, the story ends. Thank you for joining me tonight on the Sleepy History Channel. We've traversed the haunting world of the medieval plague doctors, symbols of fear, faith, and fragile humanity standing between life and death. Until our next journey together, rest well, dream sweetly, and remember, even in the darkest times, compassion and courage are the truest medicines we possess. Good night.